Welcome to a new edition of Horror Tales to Sleep. Hope you enjoy your night and remember to subscribe before to sleep. Let's begin. The town of Coldwater wasn't on any map, not officially anyway. It existed in whispers, a place locals in the surrounding areas spoke of only in hushed tones, as if uttering its name too loudly might summon something foul. I'd heard about it during a layover at a dimly lit diner off Route 88. The waitress, a worn-out woman whose name tag read Debbie, had leaned in close when I asked for directions. "Coldwater? You don't want to go there, honey." I asked why, and she hesitated before finally muttering, "They say people go there to disappear." That should have been enough. A sane person would have taken her advice. But I was neither sane nor smart when it came to the unknown. My curiosity had burned brighter than my common sense since childhood. Stories of strange towns and forgotten places were like bait on a hook. So, against all better judgment, I went. The road to Coldwater was less a road and more a suggestion, barely visible under the overgrowth of moss and weeds. My car groaned in protest as I navigated the uneven terrain, the trees around me growing denser, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. There was no cell signal this deep into nowhere, only the occasional static crackle from the radio that played songs in languages I didn't understand. Then I saw it, the sign. A battered wooden thing with peeling paint. It read, "Welcome to Coldwater. Population." The dash where a number should have been struck me as strange, but not enough to make me turn back. I pressed on, the road finally giving way to cobblestone streets. The town itself appeared suddenly, like a mirage, nestled in a valley that hadn't been there moments before. Coldwater was eerie in its perfection. The houses, old Victorian-style structures, were pristine, their paint fresh and shutters immaculate. Gas lamps lined the streets, flickering with soft amber light despite it being mid-afternoon. Yet there were no people, not a single soul. I parked in the center of what seemed to be the town square, a circular space dominated by a massive fountain. The water shimmered unnaturally, catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. I stepped out of the car, the air thick and oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it. The hum. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, almost melodic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But as I stood there, the sound grew, rising and falling in waves like an invisible choir. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the eerie acoustics of the empty town. I don't know why I expected an answer, but I got one. "New arrival," came a voice, dry and rasping, from behind me. I spun around to see a man standing at the edge of the square. He was tall and rail-thin, dressed in a black suit that looked a century out of fashion. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his tone devoid of malice, as if he were stating a fact. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. "A town," he replied cryptically. Before I could press further, the humming intensified, now accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from beneath my feet. The man's expression darkened, and without another word, he turned and disappeared into an alley. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I followed him. The alley was narrow and twisted unnaturally, leading me into a part of the town that shouldn't have existed. The buildings here were older, their facades crumbling and warped as if they'd been left in a place where time itself decayed. I found the man standing at the entrance to a basement, the door ajar and spilling dim light onto the cobblestones. "They won't wait long," he said, and before I could ask what he meant, he shoved me inside. I stumbled down a flight of rickety stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The room I landed in was vast, far larger than it had any right to be, with walls of rough-hewn stone covered in strange symbols. And then I saw them, dozens of people, all sitting in neat rows, their faces slack and lifeless, stared at a massive stone altar at the center of the room. On it sat an object, a black sphere that seemed to pulse with a sickly light, its surface rippling like liquid. The hum was deafening now, and as I approached the altar, The people began to chant in unison. Their words were guttural, inhuman, the kind of sounds that felt wrong to hear, as though they were corrupting the air itself. I didn't realize I was moving toward the sphere until I was almost touching it. Its pull was magnetic, my hand trembling as I reached out despite every fiber of my being screaming to stop. The moment my fingers grazed its surface, the room exploded into chaos. The chanting turned to screams as the people convulsed violently, their bodies twisting and contorting in ways that defied anatomy. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols glowing a bright, blinding red. And then I saw it, the thing behind the sphere. I can't describe it, not fully. It wasn't a creature or a shape, but a presence, a force that filled the room and my mind simultaneously. It whispered things to me, truths about the universe that shattered any illusion of human significance. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as visions of endless voids and writhing masses of impossible beings overwhelmed me. When I woke, I was back in my car, parked on the edge of the forest. Coldwater was gone, the road leading to it overgrown and impassable. But the hum remained, faint but persistent, a reminder of what I had seen. Now, every night, I hear it grow louder. The whispers are clearer, urging me to return. And I know that one day I will. Because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Do not follow the hum. It does not lead to salvation, only to truths you were never meant to know.
There was nothing remarkable about the engraving tool itself. It was small, fashioned from iron, with a wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. It had belonged to my father, an artisan of modest acclaim, who had etched patterns of elegance and intricacy onto everything from goblets to mausoleum plates. When the tool came into my possession, it was more a token of his life than a piece of equipment I intended to use. Yet, on the day I first held it in my hand, something stirred in me, a sense of purpose, of destiny even. I was no craftsman, but in that moment, I was overcome with the desire to create. I remember the first piece I made, a simple design carved into a discarded scrap of wood. It was crude and without symmetry, but the act itself felt transformative. It was as though the tool guided my hand, whispering shapes and lines into my mind. I began to carve obsessively. Anything that could bear a mark, a wooden box, a stone paperweight, even the surface of my own desk, became a canvas for my growing compulsion. At first, my work brought admiration. Neighbors and acquaintances marveled at the intricacy of my designs, though they often remarked on the unsettling nature of the patterns. They were too sharp, too erratic, as if each piece was imbued with a hidden disquiet. But I paid their words no mind. The more I carved, the more I felt the tool's influence. It was as if it spoke to me in dreams, its voice low and insistent, urging me to create ever more complex and elaborate designs. Soon, my work began to take on a darker tone. I found myself etching shapes I couldn't explain, twisting forms that seemed to writhe upon the surface, faces that stared out with eyes too knowing, too alive. My wife, Clara, was the first to notice the change in me. She would stand behind me as I worked, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze filled with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "You've been at it for hours," she would say, her voice tinged with concern. "Don't you think you should rest?" But I couldn't rest. The tool wouldn't let me. I tried to explain this to her, to make her understand, but the words caught in my throat. How could I describe the pull of the engraver, the way it seemed to sing to me in a language I could almost understand? One night, she tried to take it from me. I remember the moment vividly, her hand reaching for the tool, her fingers brushing against mine. The rage that surged within me was unlike anything I had ever felt. I snatched the tool away, my voice a snarl as I told her never to touch it again. After that, Clara grew distant. She would leave the room whenever I began to work, her absence a hollow weight in the house. I told myself I didn't care, that she didn't understand my need to create. But the truth gnawed at me, a quiet guilt that I tried to bury beneath layers of wood and stone. It was around this time that the dreams began. They were vivid, almost lucid, filled with scenes of carving and creation. But the materials were no longer inert objects. They were living things, flesh and bone yielding beneath the engraver's touch. I would wake drenched in sweat, the tool clutched tightly in my hand, its blade glinting in the moonlight. The designs I etched during these nights were unlike anything I had done before. They were chaotic, violent, each line a jagged wound on the surface. Yet they felt right, as though they were the truest expression of my art. The first incident occurred on a cold autumn morning. A neighbor's dog, a sprightly terrier that often wandered into our yard, was found dead near my workshop. Its body bore strange marks, as though something sharp had traced patterns across its fur and skin. Clara confronted me, her face pale with accusation. "Did you do this?" she demanded, holding the lifeless animal in her arms. I denied it, of course. I had no memory of harming the creature. But deep down, a seed of doubt took root. The designs etched into the dog's flesh were eerily similar to those I had created in my dreams. As the days turned to weeks, the world around me seemed to warp and twist. Shadows grew longer, their edges sharper, as if the lines I carved were seeping into reality itself. Clara's distance turned to fear, and I would catch her watching me with a mixture of pity and dread. I began to hear the whispers more clearly. They weren't coming from the tool, as I had once thought, but from the objects I had engraved. They would murmur to me in the dead of night, their voices filled with longing and malice. "You must finish," they would say. "You must complete the pattern." My compulsion grew insatiable. Each day I locked myself in the workshop, the engraver moving in frenzied strokes over every surface I could find. Clara avoided me entirely now, her presence reduced to fleeting glimpses as she passed by the closed door. I caught her once in the kitchen, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, her voice trembling as she asked, "What are you doing to us?" The question haunted me, yet I couldn't stop. There was something I needed to finish, though I didn't know what it was. The patterns I created no longer made sense even to me. They were maddeningly intricate, their lines converging into labyrinths that seemed to spiral into depths unseen. One night, as I stared at my latest creation, a dense, swirling design carved into the tabletop, I noticed something strange. The lines seemed to move, not in the subtle way one might perceive in a trick of the eye, but a deliberate, slithering motion, as though the carving itself was alive. I backed away, my breath hitching. The whispers grew louder, their tone urgent, almost pleading. "Closer," they said. "You must look closer." I leaned in, my hand trembling as I traced the lines with my eyes. Within the pattern, I saw something, an image, a face. It was grotesque, its features twisted and malformed, yet unmistakably human. And then, as if it were waiting for me to see it, the face turned to me and smiled. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The tool fell from my hand, clattering to the floor. The whispers turned to laughter, low and guttural, echoing through the room. That night, Clara left me. She didn't say goodbye. I only realized she was gone when I emerged from the workshop and found the house silent, her belongings missing. For a moment, I considered going after her, begging her to return. But the thought faded as quickly as it had come. The tool lay on my workbench, its blade glinting in the dim light. It called to me, its voice now a roar in my mind. I picked it up, my fingers curling around the handle, and returned to my work. The days blurred together after that. My body wasted away, my hands blistered and raw from carving. The world outside became a distant memory, its light and warmth replaced by the cold, unyielding presence of the engraver. I began to lose time. Hours, sometimes days, would vanish, leaving me disoriented and weak. The designs grew more complex, their lines intertwining in ways that seemed to defy geometry. One evening, as I etched into the surface of an old wooden chair, I felt a sharp pain in my hand. I looked down to see blood seeping from my palm, the engraver's blade embedded in my flesh. But the tool didn't fall. It stayed firmly in my grip, its presence now a part of me. I watched, transfixed, as the blood dripped onto the carving, pooling in the grooves of the pattern. The lines absorbed it greedily, their color deepening to a vivid crimson. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "Just a little more," they said. You're so close now. That night, the house changed. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The patterns I had carved into the furniture and walls began to glow faintly, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. I felt it then, the presence. It was no longer confined to the engraver or the designs. It was everywhere, filling the space around me, pressing against my mind. I tried to fight it, to resist the pull of the tool, but it was futile. My hands moved of their own accord, carving lines into the floor, the ceiling, even my own skin. The pain was excruciating, yet I couldn't stop. The patterns began to spread, their lines crawling across the room like living veins. As the final line was etched, the house shuddered. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, like the tolling of a distant bell. The patterns converged, their glow intensifying until the room was bathed in blinding light. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the workshop. I stood in a vast, empty expanse, the ground beneath me a swirling mass of the same patterns I had carved. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sky above was a sickly shade of green. In the distance, I saw them, the faces. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of them, all carved into the ground, their eyes fixed on me. "You've done well," a voice said, low and resonant. I turned to see the figure from my dreams. It was towering, its form a mass of shifting lines and shapes, its face an ever-changing swirl of patterns. "You've brought us through," it said, its voice filled with a terrible reverence. "Now, we shall carve you." I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. My body was frozen, held in place by the oppressive weight of the patterns beneath me. The towering figure began to move closer, each step causing the ground to ripple as if it were alive. "You brought this upon yourself," the voice resonated, neither cruel nor kind, merely a statement of fact. Its shifting form seemed to absorb the faint light from the ground, growing darker and more immense with each passing moment. The carved faces on the ground twisted and contorted, their mouths opening wide as if in silent wails of agony. Their eyes burned with an eerie light, locking onto me. I felt their despair, their fear, and their pain as though it were my own. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the deafening silence. The figure paused, tilting its amorphous head as though considering my question. "Because," it answered, its voice now a chorus of the faces surrounding me. "Creation demands sacrifice. You opened the door, and now you are the offering." I felt a searing pain in my chest as the patterns on the ground began to crawl upward, spreading over my skin like molten metal. My body convulsed, every nerve alight with unbearable agony. I clawed at my arms, my legs, trying to tear the lines away, but they only sank deeper, embedding themselves into my flesh. The figure watched, impassive, as the transformation continued. My skin split open along the lines of the patterns, blood seeping from the wounds in rhythmic pulses. The faces on the ground began to chant, their voices rising in a haunting melody that reverberated through the air. I begged for mercy, my words dissolving into incoherent screams as the lines consumed me. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into a kaleidoscope of shifting patterns and colors. And then, just as the pain became unbearable, it stopped. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in the workshop. The engraver lay on the workbench, its blade dull and lifeless. The room was dark and silent, the oppressive presence that had haunted me now gone. I stumbled to the mirror, desperate to see what had become of me. My reflection stared back, but it was not my own. The lines had etched themselves permanently into my skin, forming an intricate network of scars that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. My eyes were no longer human. They glowed with the same eerie hue as the patterns. I tried to speak, but my voice was no longer mine. It echoed with the whispers that had tormented me for so long, a symphony of voices that spoke in unison. "You are the vessel," they said, "the harbinger of creation." Days turned into weeks, though I no longer counted time in the way I once had. The workshop became my prison, its walls now a canvas for the patterns that poured forth from me. I carved incessantly, my hands moving of their own accord, creating designs that defied comprehension. The town grew silent. I noticed fewer lights in the windows, fewer voices in the streets. Clara never returned, though I doubted she would have recognized me if she had. One night, as I worked on a particularly elaborate carving, I heard footsteps outside the workshop. A shadow passed across the window, followed by a soft knock at the door. "Who's they?" I called, my voice a hollow echo. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. He held a knife in trembling hands, his gaze fixed on me. "You've cursed this town," he said, his voice shaking. "You've brought something terrible here. I have to stop you." I stood motionless as he approached, the blade glinting in the dim light. He lunged at me, but before he could strike, the patterns on my skin flared to life. The man froze, his body contorting as the lines spread from me to him. He screamed as they etched themselves into his flesh, his form twisting and writhing until he was unrecognizable. When it was over, he lay on the floor, his body a lifeless husk. The patterns crawled back to me, their light dimming as they settled beneath my skin. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "More," they said. "We need more." I realized then what I had become. The engraver had not only opened a door, it had made me its guardian, its tool. I was no longer a man but a conduit for the presence that now inhabited this place. The workshop's walls pulsed with a sickly glow, the patterns shifting and twisting as if alive. Outside, the world grew darker, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I no longer slept, no longer ate. My existence was consumed by the need to carve, to create, to feed the presence that had claimed me. And as the faces of the townsfolk began to appear in my patterns, their screams joining the chorus of whispers, I knew there was no escape. I was the vessel, the harbinger of creation, and I would carve until there was nothing left. The days and nights blurred into a single, unending moment, my mind trapped in a labyrinth of whispers and commands. Each stroke of the chisel felt like tearing a piece of my soul, and yet I couldn't stop. My hands worked of their own accord, driven by a force that twisted my will into submission. The workshop's walls had transformed entirely. The sickly glow intensified, pulsating in time with the rhythm of my carving. The patterns I etched were no longer mine. They emerged fully formed in my mind, alien and incomprehensible. They weren't meant for human eyes, and yet they poured out of me like a torrent, filling every surface of the room. One evening, as the last remnants of sunlight vanished, the door to the workshop creaked open. I hadn't touched it, nor had I allowed anyone entry since I had begun. My heart froze as I turned to see who, or what, had come. Standing in the doorway was a figure I couldn't immediately place. Its shape wavered, as if my eyes refused to fully focus on it. The shadows seemed to cling to its form, and the air grew colder with each passing second. "You have done well," it said, its voice like the sound of wood splintering under pressure. The figure moved closer, its steps echoing unnaturally in the small space. I recoiled, clutching the chisel in my hand as if it could protect me. "Who are you?" I managed to rasp. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural movement that sent a shiver down my spine. "I am the architect," it replied. "And you are my hand." The words struck me with the weight of finality. I tried to protest, to demand answers, but the room itself seemed to conspire against me. The walls pulsed violently, and the carved faces, those of the townsfolk, shifted. Their eyes opened, mouths contorted in silent screams. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The architect extended a hand, long and gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree, and pointed toward the largest wall in the workshop. The patterns I had carved there shimmered, shifting to reveal an immense doorway. It was not a doorway meant for this world. Its proportions were wrong, its angles twisting and defying logic. "It is time to open the gate," the architect said. "No," I breathed, shaking my head. "I can't." "You already have," it interrupted, its tone devoid of emotion. The room shuddered violently, and the air was filled with a deafening cacophony. The screams of the carved faces grew louder, merging with the whispers that had plagued me for weeks. My body moved without my consent, my hands dragging the chisel across the wall in frantic strokes. With each cut, the doorway began to widen, the glow spilling out, becoming blinding. Something was coming through, its presence immense and unknowable. As the doorway widened, the air thickened, choking me with its oppressive weight. My body trembled with the effort to resist, but my hands betrayed me, carving with a speed and precision I could not control. The screams of the faces on the walls grew louder, their once muted agony now a crescendo of despair. The architect stood motionless, its gnarled hand raised as if orchestrating my movements. "Do not resist," it commanded. "You are but a vessel. To fight is futile." The light spilling from the doorway became a vortex, pulling at everything within the workshop. Papers, tools, and even shards of wood were sucked into its depths, disappearing into the impossible void. My body swayed, my feet dragging toward the opening as the pull grew stronger. Something was emerging. At first, it was only a shadow, formless and vast. Then, it began to take shape, an enormous mass of writhing tendrils and shifting forms that defied comprehension. My mind recoiled at the sight, a splitting pain ripping through my skull as my thoughts tried to process its existence. "What is this?" I managed to choke out, the words barely audible over the roar of the vortex. "The beginning," the architect replied, its voice reverent. "You have brought forth what lies beyond, the true form." The entity from the doorway extended one of its tendrils into the workshop, its texture glistening and otherworldly. The air grew colder still, and the faces on the walls began to contort in new ways. Their mouths stretched wide, and an unearthly wail erupted from them, a sound that seemed to pierce the fabric of reality itself. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my head as the sound overwhelmed me. The tendril hovered above me, its surface shifting and rippling as though it were alive. I could feel its intent, a probing curiosity mingled with an unfathomable hunger. "No," I gasped, scrambling backward. "This isn't what I wanted." The architect's hollow gaze fixed on me. "It was never about what you wanted. Your will was a means to an end. And now, it is complete." The tendril descended, wrapping itself around my arm. A searing pain shot through me, and I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony around me. The entity's touch was both freezing and burning, its presence burrowing into my very essence. As it pulled me closer, the faces on the walls seemed to watch, their gazes filled with an eerie mixture of pity and relief. The vortex intensified, and I realized with dawning horror that the workshop itself was being consumed. The walls crumbled into the light, piece by piece, until only the floor remained beneath me. And then, the tendril pulled me through the doorway. Beyond the threshold was a realm of chaos and contradiction. The air was thick, yet I could breathe. The ground beneath me shifted like water, yet held me firm. The sky was an ever-changing tapestry of impossible colors, and the entity loomed above it all, its true form stretching endlessly into the void. I was no longer a man. I could feel my body unraveling, my thoughts dissolving into the greater whole. The entity's voice filled my mind, a chorus of whispers that spoke of ancient truths and incomprehensible designs. "You are now one with the pattern," it said. "You are eternal." Time lost meaning as I became part of the entity, my existence reduced to a single thread in the vast tapestry of its being. I saw the architect standing at the edge of the void, watching as the doorway began to close. Its work was done, and it faded into the shadows from which it had come. The faces of the townsfolk lingered in my mind, their screams echoing through the endless expanse. I realized, with what little remained of my humanity, that I had condemned them all.
Another tale begins, one born from the abyssal depths of Lovecraftian inspiration. Prepare for a descent into unspeakable horrors, where the limits of sanity and reality blur into a waking nightmare. The town of Elmont sat on a cliff's edge, perched above an ocean so black it seemed to drink the light from the sky. I had come to this forsaken place chasing an inheritance, a decrepit manor my late uncle had left me in his will. The letter had arrived without warning, its words scrawled in a trembling hand I barely recognized. "Come to Elmont. it read. "The house is yours now. Beware the tide." I thought it a strange warning, but curiosity and desperation outweighed my caution. I was between jobs, drowning in debts, and the promise of property, even in a forgotten corner of the world, was too tempting to ignore. I arrived under a slate-gray sky, the air heavy with salt and decay. The manor loomed at the edge of the cliffs, its silhouette jagged against the horizon. The town itself was lifeless, its streets empty save for a few shuttered windows and the occasional glimpse of a pale face retreating into the shadows. The house was worse than I had imagined. Its walls leaned as though bowed by an unseen weight, and the windows were dark, their glass opaque with grime. As I stepped inside, the floor groaned beneath my weight, the air thick with mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. The letter had promised a caretaker, but there was no sign of anyone. Instead, I found the key hanging from a nail in the foyer, tied with a black ribbon. The interior was a labyrinth of narrow halls and slanted rooms, filled with furniture that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. That night, as I lay in the only bed that didn't collapse under my weight, I heard it for the first time, a deep, resonant sound like the tolling of a distant bell. It came from the direction of the ocean, rhythmic and deliberate, each note sending a shiver through the house. I peered out the window, but the cliffs were shrouded in mist, the ocean below invisible. Still the sound persisted, echoing in my bones until sleep finally claimed me. In the morning I ventured into town, hoping to find someone who could explain the strange noises. The few people I encountered were reluctant to speak, their eyes darting to the cliffs whenever I mentioned the sound. "Leave before the tide comes in," an old man muttered, his voice trembling. "They don't like strangers." "Who doesn't?" I asked, but he only shook his head and hurried away. As the day wore on, I began to notice the peculiarities. The people here didn't blink. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though they were moving through water, and their eyes, dark and reflective, seemed to follow me even when their heads did not. That night, the sound returned, louder this time, and with it came the dreams. I was standing on the cliffs, staring into the abyssal ocean. The water churned and writhed as though alive, its surface breaking apart to reveal something massive beneath, an eye, larger than the manor, staring directly at me. I woke drenched in sweat, the sound of the tolling bell still ringing in my ears. Desperate for answers, I began searching the house, scouring its every corner for some clue about my uncle's life here. In the attic, I found his journal. The entries began innocuously enough: observations about the weather, notes on the house's repairs, and complaints about the isolation. But as the pages went on, his words grew erratic, his handwriting frantic. "They call from the depths," he wrote. "Their voices are in the tide, their whispers in the foam. They demand a sacrifice." The last entry was a single sentence, scrawled across the page in trembling letters: "Beware the tide." That night, the tolling bells were joined by a new sound, a wet, slithering noise that seemed to come from the cliffs. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed my belongings and fled toward the town, hoping to find refuge or at least answers. But the streets were empty, the doors locked, and the windows boarded. As I approached the cliffs, the sound grew deafening, a cacophony of tolling bells and guttural roars. The ocean churned violently, the mist parting to reveal something rising from the depths. It was impossible to comprehend. A mass of writhing tentacles and chitinous limbs, its form shifting and fracturing as though reality itself rejected its presence. The townspeople emerged from the shadows, their faces blank and their movements synchronized as they marched toward the cliffs. They began to chant, their voices blending with the tolling bells. I tried to run, but my legs refused to move. The air grew thick, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. The creature's gaze turned toward me, its eye filled with a malice that burned through my soul. The townspeople surrounded me, their hands cold and damp as they dragged me toward the edge of the cliffs. They were chanting words I couldn't understand, their voices harmonizing with the creature's guttural roars. At the last moment I broke free, stumbling backward and tumbling down a narrow path that led to the shore. The creature's roar shook the ground, but it didn't follow. I don't remember how I escaped, only that I woke up miles away, the tolling bells still echoing in my mind. Now I am far from Elmont, but the dreams remain. Every night I see the cliffs, the ocean, and the eye, and every morning I wake to the faint sound of bells in the distance, a reminder that some horrors cannot be escaped. If you ever hear the tide tolling, turn away. Some doors should never be opened.
The last rays of sunlight struggled to pierce the unending expanse of grey that stretched over the town of Ravens Hollow. The late autumn wind carried with it whispers that tangled through the skeletal trees, a haunting melody of creaks and moans. To the residents of Ravens Hollow, those whispers were not merely the wind, they were voices, and they spoke of things best left unsaid. I, Gideon Frost, had always felt an unease that clung to me like a shadow. It was a feeling I carried with me as I walked the narrow streets, my coat collar pulled high against the biting chill. The townsfolk avoided my gaze, their faces hidden behind thin curtains or turned hastily down shadowed alleys. I had long since ceased to wonder why. They had their reasons, and I had mine. It was during a late evening when I first heard the sound, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound clawed at my sanity, reverberating in my skull as though it was seeking entry. I stumbled toward the edge of town, where the woods thickened and the sky above turned a dreadful shade of obsidian. The wind grew louder, like the rasping of 100 voices. It coiled around me, pulling me deeper into the trees, their skeletal branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. It was then that I saw the clearing, an unnatural space devoid of life or light. In its center, a stone altar jutted up, ancient runes carved into its surface, their meaning lost to time. Before I could turn and flee, a voice, softer than a breath but clearer than thought, whispered my name. Gideon, come closer. The sound was familiar, yet alien. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder, and before me, the darkness swirled as though alive, taking shape. A figure emerged from the shadows, and I gasped as recognition clawed at my mind. It was Silas, my childhood friend, gone missing 3 years ago under circumstances too mysterious for even the most speculative tongues of Ravens Hollow. But now he stood before me, eyes hollow and black as pits, skin marred with the last shreds of consciousness I possessed were being swallowed by an ancient, he said, void. And his voice was a chorus of around me, not like the grasping fingers of some living beast, in a silent as if the very fabric of reality had come alive to claim me. The runes on the altar glowed a sickly green, but my limbs had grown in rhythm with my body unresponsive to the frantic commands of my mind. An ancient hunger had awoken, a presence older than the trees and with them darker than the grave, an unbearable realization and it had crept over me. I was not merely being consumed, the words was becoming with a terror that rendered me numb. The altar, the forest's mouth even the lost echoes of Silas's but it voice, was not a human smile. They were all facets of something colossal, wide, something that had slumbered beneath Ravens Hollow for centuries. Oh, Gideon, a hunger, ancient and ravenous, stretching out to devour anything to the ground, enough to and I felt the earth tremble beneath me. The creature's eyes, like clawed at the soil, of obsidian, trying to crawl focused on me, but my fingers found only the cold, I saw the reflections of my twisted like serpents. The guilt of things unsaid and dragging me toward the altar, the unrelenting loneliness that had opened within it. In the shadow of this town's dark history, to a cacophony. I saw Silas in a language forgotten by mankind, not as I had remembered him. The forest but was alive now, this new, its trees swaying and murmuring, flesh twisted, their branches weaving in a grotesque dance, eyes dull with an emptiness that would outlast the stars. Silas's voice reached me again, I whispered, but it was the words slipping through my cracked lips as my vision dimmed. The edges of my sight darkening to a muted grey. I twisted my head, and then, for the from the depths of that terrible abyss, rumbling, a new voice from the darkness of the altar, voice neither malevolent nor kind, a being that infinite in its sorrow, bone, it was not a sound, but a creature whose gaze could through my entire soul. Gideon's eyes were twin abysses, you are not alone. And as it looked at me, I felt a surge, myself a deep, unraveling, primal echo within me that had lain dormant all my life. My voice breaking as the roots tightened around my wrists and as if burned by some unseen flame. The creature's cold, unfeeling for air that tasted of frost and ash, drawing me into the altar's embrace, the shadows around me where quivered, all light was their movements halting and the forest as though cries merged with the sound of my heartbeat. The voice spoke again, desolate deeper, drumbeat, resonating through the marrow of my bones. Remember who you are. Remember what you once believed. The altar cracked, its runes shattering into shards of glowing green stone that scattered like dying stars. The creature above it roared, the sound sending shockwaves through the clearing. It was not the roar of an animal, but the scream of something torn from the fabric of creation itself. The forest twisted and writhed, its gnarled branches reaching outward as though trying to claw at the impossible thing that had come into being. And in that moment, my mind, still shrouded in the haze of terror and confusion, grasped at the voice. A memory surged to the forefront, one long buried beneath the weight of Ravenshallow's dark history. My father's voice, steady and confident, speaking in the language of our ancestors, words I had never understood but now felt as familiar as the pulse of blood in my veins. The soul is the key to the gate, Gideon. The gate that opens to the unknown, to the dark. Remember who you are, and you shall not be lost. The creature's eyes snapped toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation, a shiver of dread in the dark pools that could no longer be called eyes. I stood, my limbs trembling with the weight of what I was about to do. The forest, now a twisted and warped mockery of life, waited, its silence a smothering presence. I reached within, past the terror and past the numbness, seeking the power that had always lain dormant. The warmth of my father's voice, the memories of a life before Ravenshallow's shadows claimed it. A sudden, blinding light erupted from my chest, a light not born of flame or magic, but of something far more profound, an understanding. The creature's roar rose to a crescendo, and the clearing shuddered as if the earth itself had been struck. "You will not take me," I whispered, and the voice that answered was not just my own, but a chorus of every soul that had been lost to the dark. The creature reared back, its limbs cracking like dry branches. It was as if a part of it, an essential, thrumming part of its essence, was being drawn away by a force stronger than its ancient hunger. The runes on the altar flared one last time, casting their eerie light across the twisted land. The voice, now joined by hundreds, echoed across the clearing, bringing with it a pulse that felt like life. The shadow shivered, and then, with an unearthly wail, it collapsed into itself, swallowed by the light that now surged from my body. The forest stilled, the last shiver of movement leaving it as the echoes died down. Silence returned, heavy and expectant. I fell to my knees, spent, the world spinning around me like a cruel jest. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty, the altar now nothing more than a ruin. Silas was gone, and the whispers had ceased, leaving behind a haunting quiet. But as I stood, catching my breath, I could feel it, something in the depths of my soul, a shadow that had not disappeared but had retreated. And somewhere, in the corner of my mind, a whisper promised me that the hunger was not truly defeated. It was only waiting, hidden, and patient. The silence was deceptive, as if it were only a pause before the next chapter of my torment. The forest of Ravenshollow, once so alive with whispers and shadows, now stood still, as if it, too, were holding its breath. I staggered to my feet, feeling the weight of my body as a stranger's. My fingers, bruised and blistered, brushed against the cold, uneven surface of the altar, now reduced to fragments. In that touch, I felt the last trace of the creature's consciousness, a fleeting tremor of the dark that had tried to claim me. I turned and began to walk, the fractured forest groaning beneath my weight. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, watchful light over the land. It was no longer the comforting light of night. Now it felt like an accusation, a judgment passed over me by forces I could neither comprehend nor deny. The deeper I moved into the woods, the more I felt the whispers return, not as a chorus but as a solitary voice, soft and insistent. "Gideon! Gideon!" It called to me like an old wound, a name dragged from the depths of memory. I knew then that the battle was far from over. The darkness had not merely been defeated, it had been displaced, buried within the recesses of my mind, waiting for a moment of weakness to resurface. I stumbled into the clearing where I had first found Silas, the place now stripped of its horrors but scarred by the echoes of what had transpired. The ground was marked with the remnants of our struggle, deep gouges and scorch marks that spoke of fire and bone. I fell to my knees, the reality of the night pressing down on me with a force that made it hard to breathe. "Are you alive?" The voice startled me, raw and brittle as the bark of a dead tree. I looked up, my vision blurred by exhaustion and tears, to see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. She was cloaked in a tattered black shawl, her hair a wild tumble of dark curls that framed a face I had never seen but that felt disturbingly familiar. Her eyes, dark as night, were fixed on me, unreadable and fierce. "Who are you?" I croaked, the question slipping from my lips like a curse. "My name is Elara," she said, taking a cautious step forward. "And you? You are not the first to come seeking answers in Raven's Hollow." Her words sent a chill down my spine, colder than the grip of death itself. My hand tightened around a shard of the broken altar, the jagged edge pressing into my palm as the blood began to seep between my fingers. "Answers?" I repeated, the weight of the word ringing hollow in my ears. "There are no answers here, only echoes and shadows that never leave." She shook her head, the motion so slight it might have been a trick of the wind. "There is more to Raven's Hollow than what you have seen. The hunger you faced, it was only one part of the whole. The dark that lies beneath this land is ancient, bound by chains that even the strongest spirits fear to break." The forest seemed to shiver at her words, the trees groaning as if in response. I looked at her, the dawning realization clawing at my mind. Silas's death, the echoes of the past, the creature that had risen from the altar, it was all connected, a single, gaping wound in the fabric of reality that none dared to heal. "You know what this is," I whispered, the truth finally unfurling in my chest like the wings of some terrible bird. "And you know how to stop it." Elara stepped closer, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made the darkness behind them twist. "There is no stopping it, Gideon. There is only survival. And that means understanding the true nature of the hunger." The world shifted, a tremor passing through the ground as if in anticipation. From somewhere in the woods came the sound of a branch snapping, a dull, resonant crack that echoed like a warning. The whispers returned, louder now, as though the woods themselves were crying out. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Elara's expression darkened, her lips parting to speak, but before she could, a scream cut through the night, so raw and full of agony that it stopped my heart. It was the voice of a child, and it came from the direction of the old mill, the place where Raven's Hollow's history had been twisted by greed, betrayal, and the sharp edge of a forgotten promise. I surged to my feet, the shard in my hand forgotten as I ran toward the mill, the air closing around me like a noose. Elara was at my side, her pace unyielding as she spoke in low, urgent tones. "You were right to resist, Gideon. But there is more that you do not know. The hunger is not just a being, it is a force, and it seeks to spread, to claim the living and the dead alike." I skidded to a halt before the mill, the wooden structure looming like a monolith to decay. The whisper of the past surrounded me, seeping out of the rotting walls, and I could feel it coiling around my heart, as though it, too, had heard the call. The air around the mill was thick with an unnatural stillness, a silence that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Elara's presence was a sliver of warmth in the cold, but the chill from within the structure radiated outward, a palpable force that made my skin prickle with fear. My hand, still wet with the blood from the altar, shook as I reached out to touch the warped door, the wood blackened by centuries of neglect and dark memories. "Elara, what is this place?" I asked, my voice barely more than a breath. The darkness of the night seemed to draw closer, pressing in on us as if eager to devour our resolve. Elara's eyes were locked on the door, and I saw the flicker of something ancient and terrible pass across her face. The mill is the heart of Raven's Hollow's curse. It is where it all began, where greed and desperation gave birth to something that should never have been. It is where the hunger was first awakened. The whispers grew louder, louder than the sound of my own heartbeat, as if the entire forest was speaking in a tongue that had not been heard since the dawn of time. I felt them clawing at my mind, an invisible assault that threatened to drag me into madness. A cry rang out from inside, a desperate, childlike wail that curdled my blood. Without another moment's hesitation, I pushed the door open, the wood groaning in protest. The darkness inside was a tangible thing, coiling and slithering in the corners, as if the walls themselves were alive. The room was cloaked in shadow, with only the faint light of a flickering lantern revealing the scene before me. A figure, small and fragile, was hunched over in the far corner. Its back was to us, but I could see the shuddering rise and fall of its shoulders, the way it clutched something close to its chest as though it were the last remnant of hope. "Help me!" The voice, so familiar yet alien, sent a surge of recognition and dread coursing through me. It was the voice of Thomas, the boy who had gone missing months ago. His name, a sound so sweet yet full of terror, broke the fragile thread of my resolve. "Ilara, what is happening?" I gasped, taking a hesitant step forward. The figure in the corner did not move, but the air around it grew colder, and a pulse of energy seemed to emanate from it, resonating through the room in rhythmic waves. "Something was born here that should never have been," Ilara whispered, her voice shaking. "And now it has returned, hungry and desperate. It seeks the one who has broken its chains." My breath caught in my throat. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and a dark shape emerged from the shadows, slithering forward with an unnatural grace. It had no true form. It was a mass of shifting darkness, eyes that gleamed like shards of broken glass, and mouths that yawned open, revealing jagged teeth. A horror not of this world, a creature forged of nightmares and despair. "Ilara, what do we do?" I shouted, my voice breaking under the weight of terror. I could not tear my eyes away from the thing that had emerged, the thing that could have been summoned only by the deepest, most primal fears of the human soul. "Run!" Ilara commanded, her voice sharp and resolute. She grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door, but the creature was faster. It lunged forward, a writhing mass that oozed malice. The air grew cold, thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers intensified, pressing into my mind with such force that it felt as though my skull would split apart. I wrenched free, stumbling backward as Ilara's hand released me. Her eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, and I saw the sorrow there, the understanding that this was the end for her. "Go, Gideon. Save him," she screamed. The creature had shifted, moving faster than my eyes could follow. It lashed out with an appendage that was neither limb nor tendril, the darkness curling around the room in a storm of chaotic motion. It was as if reality itself was bending, the very fabric of the world stretching to accommodate the thing that had emerged. With an anguished cry, Ilara lunged at the creature, her figure swallowed by the shifting darkness as she drew the attention of the malevolent force. The last thing I saw before I turned and fled was her eyes, defiant and filled with regret. I stumbled through the open doorway, nearly falling as the structure shuddered around me, the sound of splintering wood and tearing stone echoing in the night. The forest was no longer a refuge, it was a maze, the trees closing in like the bars of a prison. My mind screamed for me to stop, to turn and go back, but my body obeyed the one command it knew: survive. The cries of Ilara and the dreadful cacophony of the creatures thrashing followed me as I ran, but I dared not look back. The forest seemed to shift with every step, the ground slick with an unearthly slime that pulled at my boots, threatening to drag me into the abyss. The whispers followed, a chorus that promised only death and madness, but I pressed on, driven by the memory of Ilara's final plea. The night closed in, thick as a shroud, suffocating and black. Each breath felt like inhaling ice and fire at once, my chest aching as my heart pounded against my ribs like a caged animal. The forest's path twisted and writhed before me, forming strange shapes out of shadow, guiding me deeper into a labyrinth from which there was no escape. I stumbled into a clearing where the moon, pale and sickly, seemed to shiver in the sky. The ground was slick with a dark, viscous fluid that glittered with a light not of this world. I fell to my knees, my fingers sinking into the grotesque mire as the whispers clawed at my sanity, urging me to give in, to surrender to the suffocating embrace of the unknown. It was then that I noticed them, figures, gaunt and swaying, emerging from the trees like marionettes jerked by invisible strings. Their faces were obscured by ragged hoods, but their eyes glistened with the same polished blackness I had seen in the creature back at the mill. They were moving toward me, silent save for the faint sound of scraping feet against the earth. Who are you?" My voice barely reached my ears, the air thickening as if it had been imbued with some ancient, suffocating power. One of them stopped, lifting its hood to reveal a face that was both human and inhuman, its eyes deep hollows of despair. "You know what we are," it whispered, the voice echoing inside my skull like a chorus of suffering souls. The others began to chant, low and mournful, their voices merging with the wind in a cacophony that clawed at my reason. "You are the seed, and the harvest is upon us." A shiver cascaded down my spine, my muscles locking up in fear. I knew then that I was not merely running from the creature in the mill, but from an entire web of horrors that stretched across Raven's Hollow. They were all connected, a sickening unity bound by a thirst older than time. The chanting rose, transforming into an eerie, distorted hymn that twisted the air around us. The figures raised their arms, fingers crooked like the roots of some ancient tree, and the ground trembled beneath my hands. I forced myself to stand, crawling backward on legs that threatened to collapse with each step. Then, the voice came again, echoing in the clearing, but this time it was different, clearer, as if it spoke directly into my mind. The hunger has found you, Gideon. And it will not be sated until everything is consumed. A sound like 1,000 scurrying feet erupted from the woods behind me. My blood turned to ice as I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me, piercing through the dark. Turning, I caught sight of the glistening, writhing mass of the creature that had emerged from the mill. It moved with a malevolent grace, its form shifting between the solid and the spectral, a living embodiment of despair and hunger. It crept toward me, tendrils lashing out, seeking to pull me back into its nightmarish maw. Desperate, I clawed at the ground, my fingers digging into the soil as if trying to burrow through it, to find some escape. But there was none. The world around me had become a prison of shadows, a living thing that stretched and twisted as if it had its own will. The figures in the clearing closed in, blocking any path to freedom. "You will see the truth," the voice whispered, its tone colder now, as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. "The hunger has always been here, waiting for the one who would open the door." The creature surged forward, tendrils coiling like vipers around my limbs, dragging me into the suffocating dark. The world tilted and spun, the air screaming in my ears as I was consumed by an icy blackness that felt like the end of all things. The darkness pressed in on me, a weight that seemed to twist and pull at my very soul. I was no longer in the clearing but trapped in a void that pulsated with a rhythm both hypnotic and torturous. The air smelled of rust and decay, and I could feel the cold, slick touch of something moving along my skin, as though 1,000 tiny, unseen fingers were exploring my flesh. A voice, familiar yet distorted, came from the abyss. "Gideon, the door is open. The hunger is reborn." I shuddered as the realization settled over me. I had been the one to unlock it, to stir the ancient thing from its slumber. The shadowy figures around me grew more solid, their faces twisting into expressions of agony and triumph. They circled me, their eyes flickering like dying embers as they whispered in a language that scraped against the edges of my sanity. Suddenly, the ground beneath me split open with a rending crack. A column of darkness shot up, tendrils of oily, inky substance spiraling out to consume the space around me. It was not just a creature but an embodiment of hunger, an all-encompassing void that devoured light, hope, and reason. I struggled against the restraints that bound me, but they tightened like iron chains. The creature's voice reverberated within the hollow of my mind, a cacophony of echoes. "You opened the door. Now, you must feed it." My screams were swallowed by the consuming void as it reached out, tendrils brushing against my body with an unnatural coldness. The forest behind me was lost in a swirling sea of black, and I realized, with a deep, gnawing dread, that I could no longer see the stars above. The night was gone, only the endless abyss remained. It spoke again, this time from everywhere and nowhere, "Look at what you have awakened." The whispers turned to shrieks as the creatures in the clearing leapt toward the void, disappearing into the abyss as if they had been called to some terrible feast. The ground trembled as the forest's roots shivered and cracked, splitting apart to reveal the world below, a world of endless, roiling shadows, a world where no light dared to tread. I was pulled into the dark, my screams joining the chorus of despair. Time became an endless cycle of agony, each second stretching into a lifetime. Memories of Raven's Hollow, of the mill, of the night my sister had vanished, all of it dissolved, leaving only the understanding that I was part of something vast and unknowable, an eternal hunger that devoured everything it touched. The voices reached a fever pitch, and then, silence. A sudden light pierced through the darkness, so bright and pure that it felt like a blade cutting through the fabric of reality itself. It was a memory, a vision of Annabelle, standing at the edge of the forest, eyes filled with an unreadable emotion. "I will find you, Gideon," she said, her voice a mix of warmth and regret. Even if the darkness claims us all. The world began to shift and shatter, the hunger's voice faltering as though something else had entered the fray. A surge of warmth spread through my veins, burning away the cold. The shadows hissed and recoiled, their form dissolving as the ancient hunger screeched in rage. The light grew brighter, surging through the abyss with an intensity that seared my vision and seared my soul. The creatures shrieked, their bodies twisting and warping as if caught in an infernal blaze. They melted into pools of shadow, their cries dissipating like the last remnants of a nightmare. The cold tendrils released me, the chains binding me shattered into 1,000 shards of glass, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air that felt so sweet it was almost intoxicating. Annabel's voice, though distant, resonated in the center of my mind. "Remember who you are, Gideon. Remember what you fight for." I forced myself to my feet, the pain in my limbs an echo of the torment that had taken hold of my body. The void rumbled beneath my feet, a deep, pulsing growl as it tried to regain its dominion. From within its depths, something else began to stir, a being older than time itself, a consciousness that defied comprehension. Its eyes, vast and filled with malice, opened within the void, watching me with an unblinking gaze that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of my existence. The voice of the hunger returned, no longer a whisper but a guttural roar echoing off the shattered trees and crumbling walls. "You cannot banish me, Gideon. I am the void, I am the end." I took a deep breath, my chest aching as the air pressed down on me, heavy with the scent of brimstone and blood. The world was no longer familiar, it had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows and splintered reality. But I knew one thing, I was not alone. Annabel's image flickered in the corners of my vision, and I grasped the memory of her voice like a lifeline. I reached deep within, past the fear and pain, past the haunting doubt that had threatened to drown me. There, in the dark recesses of my mind, I found it, the strength to defy the ancient hunger. It was not power, not strength forged in the crucible of battle, but something more profound, the love that refused to die, the bond that connected me to Annabel even in death. "Your hunger ends here," I shouted, my voice breaking the silence that had shrouded me like a suffocating blanket. The void shuddered, the eyes within it narrowing into slits of fury. A storm erupted, a wind so fierce that it tore at my clothes and hair, sending tendrils of shadow whipping around me. The creatures that had once been a chorus of agony now fled, as if recognizing the power that surged in my veins. I felt a warmth spread through me, illuminating the corners of my mind with a golden light. The creature's voice wavered, its form writhing as if in pain. "You cannot resist the end." I took a step forward, the ground cracking beneath me. "I have already faced the end," I said, raising my hand, fingers trembling with the pulse of light that now emanated from my being. "And I choose to defy it." With a final, shuddering roar, I unleashed the force within me. The golden light exploded, weaving tendrils that surged into the void, pushing back the darkness and shattering the eyes that had stared into me with such dread. The air was filled with a deafening crack as the void splintered, a cacophony that resonated in my bones and set fire to the night. The hunger screamed one last time, its voice shattering into an eerie silence that blanketed the world. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood amidst the ruins of the shattered landscape, my chest heaving, eyes wide as I scanned the world that had been both my torment and my salvation. Cold Harrow, the place of nightmares, was now an empty, crumbling shell of stone and wood, the once massive trees reduced to skeletal remains, their roots clawing at the ground like the fingers of some fallen giant. The wind blew, but it carried no sound, no whispers of the creatures, no echoes of the dark laughter that had once filled the night. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and almost musical, drifting to me from somewhere deep within the ruins. It was a voice I knew well, one I had feared I would never hear again. Annabel's voice, clear and warm, yet threaded with an ache that made my heart clench. "Gideon." I turned, eyes searching the blackened remnants, and there, standing at the edge of a broken wall, was her silhouette. Her figure shimmered, as if composed of moonlight and shadow, an ephemeral vision that seemed to float just out of reach. The light of the pale moon cast its glow across her face, illuminating the tears that traced silent paths down her cheeks. "Annabel," I whispered, stepping forward, but my legs felt leaden, as though they would betray me. Is it truly you? Her expression was one of sadness mixed with love, and she nodded. You did it, Gideon. You brought the light where the darkness threatened to claim us all. But at what cost? I asked, my voice ragged, my throat dry as though I had swallowed fire. What remains of me now? Of us? A shadow of sorrow crossed her face, but she smiled, a fleeting, beautiful smile that spoke more than words ever could. The hunger has been banished, and the dark is no longer a prison. We have been set free, Gideon. And so have you. A great shudder passed through the ground, as if the earth itself was exhaling. The shadows that clung to the ruins shrank, receding like a tide that had finally found its retreat. The cool touch of wind became warm and gentle, and with it came the scent of life, of earth and rain. The fire of the world that had been stolen from me, that I had fought to reclaim, now roared back to life within my chest, not as a flame of rage or pain, but one of hope. I reached for Annabel, my hands trembling as they passed through her image, and a pang of grief split through my heart. She was there, yet she was not. But for the first time since that night began, I felt the finality of my actions settle into my bones. It's time, Annabel whispered, the wind carrying her voice away as her figure began to fade. The world will carry on, Gideon. But remember this, even in the darkest night, light still finds a way. And then, she was gone, leaving behind only the faintest echo of her laughter, a sound like the distant chime of a bell at dawn. The ruins of Cold Harrow stood silent and solemn, a graveyard of memories, but I knew it was not an end. It was a beginning. I walked away from the place where nightmares had lived, where the echoes of hunger still threatened to creep back into my thoughts, and yet they were stilled now, held back by the memory of light, the warmth of a love that had not succumbed to the darkness. As I left, I could not help but glance over my shoulder one last time, a bitter smile curving my lips. The world was vast, filled with endless possibilities and dark corners that would never be fully illuminated. But the hunger was no longer a force within me. It was a shadow in the past, a tale whispered to the winds, and a scar that would fade in time. With each step, I felt the weight of the past loosen its grip, replaced by a quiet resolve. Cold Harrow was no longer my home, but the memory of the battles fought and the love that had transcended even death would follow me as a guide. And as the dawn broke across the landscape, painting the blackened earth with hues of gold and crimson, I walked into the light, carrying the echo of Annabel's voice in my heart, knowing that some battles were worth every sacrifice, and that even the deepest hunger could not silence the human will to survive and to love. The hunger had been defeated, but in the corners of my mind, in the depths where light dared not venture, I could still feel it waiting. Patient. Hungry. But for now, it was content to wait. And so was I.
The air thickens as another tale emerges from the shadows, born of madness and despair. Prepare to descend into an abyss where sanity falters and dread reigns supreme. The Veil of the Infinite. It began with a letter, brittle and yellowed with age, delivered to my door by an unseen hand. I found it there one gray morning, nestled against the warped wood as though it had been left by the wind itself. The handwriting was angular and foreign, yet my name was unmistakable on the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, the ink smudged but legible. To you who seeks the truth, there is a place where the sky bleeds into the earth, where the stars themselves bear witness to things unspeakable. The veil calls to you. Come, if you dare. There was no signature, no return address, only coordinates that led to a place I had never heard of, a hollow marked on no map, far from any road. I should have ignored it. I should have burned the letter and cast its words to the wind. But the lure of the unknown, the insidious curiosity that festers in the human soul, proved too strong. The journey was grueling. Days of travel through winding paths and forgotten trails led me to the coordinates. The air grew colder, heavier, as though laden with invisible chains. When I arrived, it was twilight, and the sky was an unnatural shade of purple, streaked with veins of light that pulsed like a dying heart. Before me stood an arch of black stone, ancient and weathered, its surface etched with symbols that defied comprehension. As I stepped through the arch, a chill ran down my spine. The world on the other side was not the same. The Vale was a wasteland, its ground cracked and barren, its horizon obscured by an ever-shifting fog. The air hummed with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in my bones. There was no sun, no moon, only a sky that seemed to writhe with distant shapes. I wandered, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, until I saw them. Figures cloaked in tattered robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They stood in a circle around a monolith of gleaming obsidian, their hands raised in supplication. The symbols on the stone pulsed with an inner light, and the air around it shimmered as though on the verge of collapse. One of them turned to me, and though their face was hidden, I felt their gaze pierce through me. "You have come," they said, their voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "The Vale accepts its own." I wanted to run, but my legs betrayed me, carrying me closer to the circle. The robed figures parted, allowing me to approach the monolith. As I stood before it, the symbols seemed to shift and writhe, forming patterns that burrowed into my mind. Images flooded my thoughts, planets devoured by shadows, stars extinguished by unseen hands, and a darkness that stretched across infinity. "It sees you now," the voice whispered. The monolith pulsed, and a crack formed in its surface. From the fissure spilled a black mist, thick and roiling, that coiled around me like a living thing. I tried to scream, but the mist poured into my mouth, filling my lungs with a cold that burned. My vision blurred, and the world dissolved into darkness. When I awoke, I was no longer in the Vale. I was in my home, the letter still clutched in my hand, though the ink had faded to illegibility. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream. But then I saw the marks, black veins crawling beneath my skin, pulsing with an unnatural light. My reflection in the mirror was not my own. My eyes were dark and infinite, filled with stars that no longer shone in the sky. And in the distance, beyond the veil of reality, I heard it, a voice that was not a voice, calling my name.
The next story you're about to hear is based on a real-life story that many of you know. Vampires? Do you hear about them? If not, you're going to. The autumn winds howled through the ancient hills of Hungary, carrying whispers of forgotten legends. The year was 1897, and the long, winding path to the manor was shrouded in mist as Jonathan Harker traveled deeper into the heart of the Carpathian Mountains. With each rattling clatter of his carriage wheels, the unease in his chest grew. He tightened his coat against the chill, glancing nervously at the trees that seemed to claw at the passing darkness. A letter from his fiancée, Mina, crumpled in his pocket, the ink smudged from the sweat of his palm. He had read it countless times, a small comfort during the perilous journey. Yet now, the words seemed distant, almost otherworldly. Dracula, he muttered under his breath, the name heavy as lead. The carriage pulled to a halt before an imposing stone edifice, the castle of Count Dracula. Its jagged silhouette cut a grotesque figure against the moon, and for a moment, Jonathan wondered if he had not reached the threshold of another world, a place where the laws of man no longer held sway. The doors creaked open, revealing a darkened foyer draped in shadow. He stepped out, the chill seeping into his bones, and was met by a figure whose presence seemed to devour the light. Count Dracula stood there, eyes gleaming with an unsettling familiarity. "Welcome to my home, Mr. Harker," the Count's voice, deep and lilting, echoed through the great hall. His gaze was steady, fixed, and Jonathan felt a shiver skitter down his spine. They exchanged pleasantries, and Jonathan's polite responses were met with a keen interest that bordered on obsession. Dracula's words were measured, careful, as if each syllable was part of an elaborate game. As they sat at a grand dining table, candles flickering, the Count poured wine that glistened like blood in the dim light. The taste was metallic, sharp, and Jonathan forced himself to swallow. They spoke of England, of the real estate the Count sought, and of the strange beauty of the unknown. But as the conversation deepened, the air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Dracula's eyes followed Jonathan with a predatory glint, a hunger that was impossible to name. Later, when Jonathan retired to his chamber, he could not shake the feeling of being watched. The cold moonlight spilled through the window, cutting silver lines across the room. A sudden knock at the door made him jump, his heart thundering like a war drum. It was the Count. "Mr. Harker, I trust you are comfortable," Dracula said, his voice smooth as silk, yet sharp as a blade. The room felt smaller, the shadows pressing in. "Yes, thank you, Count," Jonathan managed, his voice tight. Dracula's smile did not reach his eyes. "There is something in this place that does not sleep, Jonathan. You will find that you are not alone." With that, he left, and Jonathan was left staring into the echo of silence. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and dread. The castle's vast corridors were like veins, winding and pulsing with an ancient, unseen life. Jonathan would hear the faintest of sounds, whispers behind doors, the rustle of fabric in the dark. Shadows seemed to move with a will of their own, shifting in and out of sight. One night, as the wind howled outside, Jonathan's own hand was cut open, a brief but sharp pain searing his palm. The blood welled up, hot and red, and before he could move, he felt the presence behind him. He turned, heart seizing in his chest, to find Dracula standing there, eyes wide and unblinking, his lips quivering with a strange hunger. "Forgive me," the Count whispered, though his voice was no more than a rasp. "But blood, it calls." Jonathan recoiled, the room spinning, but Dracula simply bowed his head and left, leaving behind an air that crackled with something malignant and alive. It was then that Jonathan knew the darkness within the castle was not just the absence of light, but the embodiment of something older, something with a pulse and a will. The days passed, and Jonathan's body grew weaker, his reflection in the mirror growing paler, more hollow with each passing hour. And then, one evening, as twilight crept across the land, he stumbled upon a sound that made him stop dead in his tracks. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers against stone. He traced the noise down a narrow passage, and as he stepped into the flickering glow of torchlight, he found himself in a room unlike any other. It was small, with vaulted ceilings, and the walls were adorned with carvings, symbols that seemed to shift when he blinked. At the center stood one of Dracula's brides, her eyes wide, her expression unreadable. The air seemed to thrum, and Jonathan's pulse quickened. "You're not the first to see this," she whispered, her voice like the wind through dry leaves. "But you may be the last." Suddenly, the castle shuddered, a low groan resonating through the stone. The night outside split with a crack of thunder, and Jonathan knew, deep in his soul, that whatever this place hid was about to be revealed. As the castle trembled, the stones vibrating beneath his feet, Jonathan staggered forward, clutching the edge of the stone altar in front of him. The bride's eyes locked with his, and there was something in their depths, an understanding, a warning, that made his blood run cold. "Run," she whispered, almost too faint to hear over the noise. But he didn't move. His limbs were heavy, bound by terror and the unrelenting weight of dread that pressed down on his chest. From the shadows, a low, guttural growl reverberated, and he turned to see the Count, standing at the threshold of the chamber, his form stretched and contorted, as if trying to contain something monstrous inside. The pale, angular face that had once seemed so inviting now held only a brutal, predatory hunger. "You have seen too much, Jonathan," Dracula said, his voice deep and resonant, yet tainted by an otherworldly rasp. His lips parted, revealing teeth that seemed longer, sharper than before. "And now you will know what it means to be a part of this." Jonathan's heart was a wild, panicked drumbeat as he stumbled backward, away from the grotesque figure advancing toward him. He glanced over his shoulder, seeking an escape route, but the walls of the room seemed to close in, the symbols carved into the stone glowing with a sickly green hue. The air felt thick, heavy with an electric charge that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Before he could decide on a course of action, the bride stepped forward, blocking his path, her eyes wide and fearful. "He will kill you if you don't flee," she said, her voice trembling. The Count halted, tilting his head as if considering her words. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the wind that howled outside, clawing at the ancient stone. Then, as if dismissing any notion of hesitation, Dracula let out a laugh that chilled Jonathan to the bone, a sound like cracked glass and the shattering of old bones. Jonathan lunged to the side, past the bride, and bolted down the corridor, the stone floors cold underfoot. The castle seemed alive, shifting and groaning, as though it were trying to keep him from escaping. He darted through a labyrinth of hallways, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, eyes darting between the flickering light and the dark, unending corridors. Behind him, footsteps echoed, rhythmic and relentless, as if some unseen force were hunting him. He dared not look back, but every instinct in his body screamed that Dracula was close, the sound of his pursuit almost as palpable as the wind's howl. He burst into what appeared to be an abandoned chapel, the wooden pews dust-covered and warped, and the altar at the far end shrouded in a dim, unnatural glow. His eyes caught a glint of metal, a crucifix, left forgotten, its silver catching the candlelight. Desperate, he snatched it up and pressed it to his chest. For a heartbeat, there was silence, and then a deep, primal roar that shook the very stones of the castle. Dracula was here. Jonathan backed away as the Count materialized at the entrance, eyes aglow with a feral, inhuman light. The dark, ancient eyes that had first met his now seemed to have taken on the lifeless, cold quality of stone. The room filled with an impossible silence, the stillness pressing against him as though the world had paused. And then, in a flash, Dracula moved, faster than a human eye could track. Jonathan's scream was swallowed by the night as the Count's fingers wrapped around his wrist, pulling him close. The air grew colder, the light dimming as if the castle itself were holding its breath. Jonathan's pulse raced, the fear overwhelming him as the Count leaned forward, the sharpness of his fangs casting eerie glints in the dim light. "Jonathan Harker," Dracula said, his voice the faintest whisper, heavy with dark promises. "You will become a part of me." A cold, sharp pain shot through his arm, as if fire had been poured into his veins. Jonathan's vision dimmed, the room spinning as darkness pressed in, claiming him. Just as the last shreds of his consciousness slipped away, he caught sight of the bride, her face now pale and full of sorrow, and for a moment, he thought he heard her voice, whispering, "Forgive me." The world went black. The chill of the stone floor was a cruel reminder that Jonathan's body was still in the castle, still bound to this place that reeked of decay and death. His senses flickered to life, the sharp tang of blood and the metallic scent of old iron in the air making him gag. The agony in his arm was an endless, pulsing throb that reverberated through his entire being. Yet, there was a strange stillness within him now, as if a dark river had taken him, carrying him far from the shores of reason and hope. He tried to move, but the weight of his limbs seemed suffocated, shackled to the ground. The floor beneath him felt cold and rough, each stone as unyielding as the silence that filled the chamber. His vision was blurred, the edges of the room splintered into darkness that shivered with movement. It was then that he realized the whispers were not a figment of his mind but the soft murmurs of the castle itself, an ancient, almost sentient sound that resonated through the stone and into the marrow of his bones. A noise, faint but unmistakable, reached him from the hallway. It was the sound of hurried footsteps, coming toward him with a sense of urgency that spurred him to fight against the shackles of his own body. He blinked, desperately trying to focus, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure. A woman, moving with the grace of one who knew every shadow of the castle, who belonged to its dark heart. It was Mina. Mina, his voice, when it emerged, was little more than a rasp, a broken plea that carried none of the strength he had known before. He tried to call out to her, but his throat was dry, his voice caught in a rattle of breath. Mina's eyes locked with his, a blend of determination and dread. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering just above his face, as if afraid to touch him. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice cracking, but there was a flicker of life in her expression. "I found you." He tried to speak, but his words were tangled in the pain that seemed to wrap around him like a vice. His limbs began to respond, quivering with a new, desperate energy, but it wasn't enough to break free. The dark behind her eyes grew deeper, more suffocating, and for the briefest of moments, she glanced at the wound on his arm, now nothing more than a red, festering mark. Did you see him?" Jonathan managed, the words tasting of iron and ash. The room seemed to tilt and sway with the rhythm of the castle's breath, the silence between them deafening in its weight. Mina's lips pressed into a thin line, the corners of her mouth twitching as though resisting a shudder. He knows. He knows that we're trying to stop him. Her gaze flitted to the shadows at the edge of the room, a nervous tremble in her shoulders. The sound of distant, shuffling footsteps echoed, and the subtle jangle of metal scraping against stone brought forth a shiver. The others? Jonathan rasped, his pulse hammering in his ears. He needed to know. He needed to understand if the others were still safe. They're holding on, Mina said, the lie evident in the tremble of her voice. The air grew colder, an unnatural frost seeping from the walls. Jonathan's heartbeat quickened as the sound of laughter, hollow and dark, unfurled from the darkness at the far end of the room. It was a sound that made his bones ache and his vision blur. He turned to see a figure moving forward, tall, slender, and surrounded by an otherworldly presence that made the air crackle with dread. Dracula. A voice, deep and impossibly powerful, spoke, its words stretching like a dark shroud through the chamber. So, we meet again, Jonathan Harker. And now, you will truly understand the nature of what you've become. Mina's hand closed around Jonathan's, fingers tightening, but the warmth of her touch was already fading, the skin beneath her fingertips as cold as death. Jonathan fought to keep his eyes on her, but the pain surged, pulling him under, tearing away what little hope he had left. Dracula's shadow, long and twisted, crept across the floor like an extension of his own will, spreading out like the roots of a terrible tree. It moved with the grace of a predator, every step filled with an almost playful malice. As he stepped forward, the flickering light revealed the grotesque beauty of his face, the sickly perfection that hid the abyss within. "Welcome," he said, the word dripping with venom, "to your new existence." Mina lunged forward, her eyes locked with his. "Leave him alone," she shouted, her voice a defiance that burned through the cold and the silence. Dracula tilted his head, a sharp grin forming as he observed her, a hunger as ancient as time itself flickering in his gaze. "Oh, I'm afraid he's already mine," he replied, stepping closer to Jonathan, whose vision was growing dim, the edges of his sight blurring as the room tilted and the whispers returned, growing louder, chanting a dark refrain. Mina's scream split the silence, but it was too late. Darkness enveloped them all, and the castle shuddered, holding its breath as the fate of the room sealed itself with a sound like bone cracking. The room seemed to pulse, the walls shaking with a feral power that sent ripples through the stone, dislodging dust and making the torches sputter and flare. Jonathan's vision was an unending blur, the light of the flickering flames casting long, jagged shadows that leaped across the chamber. The whispers grew louder, sharper, and more insistent, threading themselves into his mind like a serpent seeking entry. Mina's voice, fierce and unyielding, pierced through the chaos. "You won't take him. Not while I breathe." Her figure loomed above him, half lit by the pale, trembling light. He could see the defiance in her eyes, the way she stood her ground even as the room trembled beneath their feet. But it was too late. The creature had already reached out, its cold, long fingers grazing Jonathan's brow. Jonathan gasped, the breath stolen from his lungs as the darkness surged into him, curling around his consciousness like a vice. He tried to scream, but his voice was trapped, a hollow echo that reverberated in the back of his throat. His body fought against the invasion, muscles straining, blood racing, but there was no strength left. A wave of icy dread washed over him, the weight of his own helplessness pressing down until his limbs turned to lead. "Jonathan," Mina whispered, her eyes wide and wet with fear and desperation. The floor underfoot cracked, splintered as though the castle itself was resisting what was happening. But Dracula did not stop. He was already drawing closer, the hunger in his eyes deepening with every heartbeat. Suddenly, there was movement from the doorway. Sister Agatha appeared, her silhouette framed by the shifting shadows. The glint of silver in her hand caught the torchlight, and the weapon she held was unmistakable, a stake, sharp and unforgiving. Her presence filled the chamber with a new energy, fierce and determined. "Back away, Count." Agatha's voice was a battle cry, a challenge thrown into the wind that carried with it all the power of faith and resolve. The Dark Prince turned, his expression a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "And who are you to defy me?" he hissed, the words dark tendrils that seemed to coalesce in the air between them. His gaze shifted to the weapon in Agatha's hand, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, an understanding that this was no ordinary adversary. "I am the one who will end you," Agatha declared, and with a sudden surge of strength, she lunged forward, the stake aimed at the heart of the beast. But before she could make contact, Dracula moved faster than thought, his form shifting from man to shadow and back, a sickening display of power that sent her sprawling to the ground. The stake clattered across the floor, landing inches from where she lay. The castle shuddered again, a groaning sound that seemed to come from its very foundation. Jonathan's eyes fluttered, the edges of his vision spiraling as the room seemed to melt into a strange, stifling darkness. Mina's scream, a raw and primal sound, cut through him, and in that moment, his soul felt as though it had been torn asunder. "Jonathan!" Mina cried, reaching for him, but her touch was blocked by a wall of impenetrable darkness. Her eyes, wide with terror and love, met his one last time before the shadows consumed her. Dracula turned back to him, a wicked smile creeping across his face. The power in his eyes sparked, a crimson light that seemed to hold the weight of all the horrors the night could conjure. He raised his hand, and with a swift motion, the shadow around him deepened, growing claws that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the room. Jonathan's body went rigid, unable to move, unable to resist. But then, just as the darkness threatened to take him entirely, a different light filled the room, a glow as bright as the morning sun, slicing through the veil of shadows. The sound of 1,000 voices, chanting in unison, surged with it, and the walls of the castle began to burn, a white-hot blaze that seemed to banish every trace of the night's horrors. Dracula howled, the sound a terrible, shuddering thing that reverberated through the stones. His form twisted and stretched, the elegance of his face splitting apart into something monstrous, an abomination at the heart of the night. But even as he fought against the light, his power began to wane, the shadows faltering as the blaze spread. "Agatha," Jonathan whispered, barely conscious, his strength a whisper in the storm. But before he could call out again, the flames surged higher, and Dracula's scream was cut short as the fire consumed him, tearing him away like a scream lost to the wind. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the battle that had come before. Jonathan's mind spun, the pain in his arm no longer a burning agony but a dull throb, like the final heartbeat of a dead man. The castle, though still dark and twisting, seemed quieter now, as if waiting for something else to come, something hidden in the farthest shadows. Sister Agatha, bruised and blooded, picked up the stake and looked at Jonathan, her face a portrait of exhaustion and relief. "The battle is far from over," she said, her voice steady as the embers in the room died down. "But for now, we have won." Jonathan's eyes met hers, his own heart catching in the shifting light. The fight for life, for survival, was far from over. But tonight, there was a flicker of hope, small and fragile, but there nonetheless. The castle's halls were still, almost as if they were holding their breath, waiting for the next movement, the next sound. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind blackened stone walls that exhaled heat in suffocating waves. The night outside remained cloaked in darkness, with only the occasional cry of a distant bird breaking the silence, an eerie sound that seemed to mock the terror that had just passed. Jonathan sat on the edge of an old wooden chair, its carvings now splintered and scorched, the remnants of a battle he could scarcely comprehend. Sister Agatha moved around the room, the faded grey of her habit streaked with dirt and blood. Her eyes were sharp, searching the shadows for movement, for a sign of the Count's return. "Is it over?" Jonathan whispered, each word a fragile thread. Agatha looked at him, her face illuminated by the flickering glow of a lantern that had survived the fire. "Dracula may be vanquished, but his reach extends far beyond these walls. His followers, those who are not yet dead, will come. We have only a brief reprieve." Jonathan's heart sank as the realization settled over him. He had seen the Count in his most monstrous form, a creature with eyes as deep and hollow as the void, and he understood now that the night was far from its conclusion. Whatever had been summoned by the darkness within the castle had not been destroyed. It had only been repelled, like an ancient, wounded beast waiting for its chance to strike again. "Do we have time to rest?" he asked, the exhaustion dragging at his limbs, pulling him into the shroud of despair. Agatha shook her head. "Rest will come only when the last of the dark power is extinguished. For now, we move. Mina is still out there, and if the Count has his way, she will be the key to everything." The sound of her name in Agatha's voice cut through him like a blade, fresh and raw. Mina, the woman he had promised to protect, who had suffered and fought and now stood at the edge of the unknown. The memory of her eyes, filled with a love that had once been pure, a love now tainted by terror and shadow, made his chest ache with a grief that felt like an open wound. "I must find her," Jonathan said, standing with a sudden, fierce determination. The room tilted, spinning like a topsy-whirled, but he pushed through it, leaning heavily on the edge of the table for support. "Jonathan, you're not in a state to," Agatha began, but he cut her off with a glare that held all the weight of desperation. "I don't care. I will find her, and I will bring her back. If the Count dares to take her, then he will face the wrath of a man who has nothing left to lose." For a moment, Agatha said nothing, the silence between them a battle of wills. But then she nodded, eyes glinting with a determination of her own. "Then we go. But we go prepared. There is an old library beneath this castle, a place untouched by time. If there is any knowledge left to be found, it will be there." Jonathan's chest tightened with both hope and dread. What could they possibly learn in the belly of this fortress that might help them? Yet, the thought of standing still was worse than the fear of what they might find. He nodded and followed her as she moved towards the shadows, a faintly carved torch in her hand. The flames wavered as they walked, casting long, distorted figures that seemed to reach for them, hungry and waiting. The corridors were cold, far colder than the main halls, and the air seemed to twist around them, thick with the scent of damp stone and something metallic. The walls closed in, whispering in a language older than man, as if the castle itself were a living, breathing entity that resented their intrusion. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became, each step a thundering echo that taunted them with the knowledge that they were not alone. Suddenly, Agatha paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked to the left. In the dim light, Jonathan saw what she had spotted, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, partially obscured by the darkness. Its form was lean, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular. A figure that looked as though it had been carved from the night itself. "Stay behind me," Agatha whispered, raising the stake as if it were a weapon against the dark. The creature stepped forward, its eyes glowing with a greenish hue that mirrored the faint light of the torches. It was no vampire, at least not one Jonathan had ever seen. Its face was more human than beast, yet its features twisted into a grotesque parody of a man, as if it were a shadow trying to mimic a life it could never attain. "Come no closer," Agatha warned, her voice steady, yet Jonathan noticed the slight tremble in her fingers. He could not blame her. The creature was fear made flesh, a thing of nightmares that clawed at the edges of reality. The creature's mouth opened, revealing fangs that dripped with a dark, glistening fluid. "You have come for the one who was taken," it rasped, its voice thin and brittle, yet dripping with malice. "You will find only death." Agatha's eyes met Jonathan's for a fleeting moment, and he saw the unspoken understanding in them. Whatever this thing was, it was the first of many challenges they would face. And if they did not defeat it, there would be no Mina to save. "Not today," Agatha said, and with a sudden burst of movement, she lunged forward, driving the stake into the creature's chest. A sound that was part scream, part hiss escaped its throat as it shuddered, its body convulsing as if caught in the throes of an invisible flame. But instead of collapsing, it drew back, letting out a rasping laugh that echoed in the stone hall, a sound that would haunt Jonathan for the rest of his life. With a final, strangled cry, the creature dissolved into mist, leaving only the faint scent of ash and the cold touch of a breeze in its wake. Jonathan's heart thudded in his chest, the silence that followed almost deafening. "What in God's name was that?" he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. Agatha exhaled slowly, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "The first of many, Jonathan. And now, we must find Mina before it's too late." The air seemed to thicken around them, pressing down like an invisible hand. Jonathan's mind spun with what had just happened. The creature's grotesque form seared into his memory. The echo of its voice, that dreadful laugh, still reverberated in the darkness. He took a shaky breath, trying to dispel the terror that gnawed at him. But his limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the darkness itself were leeching the strength from his body. Agatha, unyielding in her resolve, moved forward, her eyes scanning the corridors as if the walls themselves were preparing to close in. They were no longer in the main part of the castle but had descended into the deeper levels, into the maze of stone and shadow that had once been sealed off from the rest of the world. This was where secrets were kept, where the blood of generations had been spilled in silence. "Stay close," Agatha said, her voice tight. "Whatever that thing was, it was not a stray. The castle has eyes and ears. We need to be careful." Jonathan swallowed hard, nodding, but the sight of his own reflection in the cracked glass of a nearby mirror made him pause. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, the skin beneath them shadowed with exhaustion. He had been through too much already, and yet the feeling of something lurking just beyond the edge of the torchlight made the hair on his neck rise. "Do you hear that?" Agatha's voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it cut through the gloom like a knife. Jonathan strained to listen, the silence so profound it felt like a tangible entity. But there, just barely audible, a faint, rhythmic sound reached his ears. Thumping, the pace of something heavy moving along the stone. His heart clenched in terror as they both turned to follow the noise down a narrow corridor. The stone walls seemed to close in tighter, the air colder. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows that made the hallway twist and shudder like living things. It was then that they saw it. A figure hunched at the far end of the hall, a silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of a gas lamp. Its head was bowed, and its shoulders were stooped as though burdened by an unbearable weight. "Who? What is that?" Jonathan muttered, fear creeping into his voice. Agatha didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a small silver crucifix from around her neck and held it out, its light casting a narrow band of pale brightness that cut through the dark. The figure stopped moving, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then, it lifted its head, revealing eyes that glistened with an unnatural, inhuman shine. It was a man, if the word could be used to describe it. His flesh was taut over his bones, with patches of it peeling like melted wax. He had a twisted, malformed mouth that seemed to stretch too wide, filled with sharp teeth that glistened in the pale light. "Run," Agatha whispered, but it was too late. The creature lunged forward, moving faster than humanly possible. Its limbs bent in grotesque angles, its stride a sickening, jerky dance. Jonathan's heart leaped into his throat as he stumbled back, his mind screaming at him to move. He grabbed Agatha's arm, pulling her as they dashed for an archway to the side, but the creature was relentless, its claws slashing the air behind them with a wet, ripping sound. They barely made it through the archway, Jonathan's pulse pounding as he dragged Agatha forward, crashing into an old study that had once been used by the monks who had lived in the castle long before it had become Dracula's fortress. Dust lay thick on the floor, and ancient tomes sat on the shelves, half decayed and covered in the mold of age. A cold, musty scent filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Agatha staggered against a bookshelf, clutching at her side where a deep gash had appeared, a thin line of blood trailing down her habit. Jonathan's chest heaved as he surveyed the room, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. His eyes landed on an old, rusted sword on the wall, its blade dull but still wickedly sharp. He grabbed it without hesitation, swinging it experimentally as the creature's guttural growl echoed through the stone hall behind them. "Do you think we can kill it?" Jonathan asked, more to himself than to Agatha. She straightened, eyes blazing with determination despite the pain etched into her features. "Not unless we find out what it is and how to stop it. And fast." Before Jonathan could answer, the creature lunged through the archway, its body contorting unnaturally as it landed. Its mouth opened wide, a sound of guttural, bone-chilling laughter escaping it as it crawled forward, the sharp, brittle sound of its bones creaking with each movement. Agatha met its charge head-on, stake in hand, her eyes locked with Jonathan's as she shouted, "Get out of here, Jonathan. Find Mina." No, he roared back, gripping the sword tighter, feeling its weight balance in his hands. I won't leave you. The creature came down upon her, its claws aiming for her throat, but Agatha spun, driving the stake forward. It met its mark with a sickening, wet thud. The creature screeched, a sound so inhuman it rattled Jonathan's teeth, and as it fell, it dissolved into a mass of black, writhing tendrils that splattered against the stone walls, leaving behind a stain that seemed to pulse like a living thing. Agatha collapsed, gasping for breath, the color drained from her face. Go, Jonathan, she whispered, voice shaking as she reached out to him with a hand that trembled. Find her. He hesitated, torn between the urgency to save her and the knowledge that Mina's life hung in the balance. The memory of her eyes flashed before him, and with a single, pained nod, he turned, sprinting down the narrow passage and into the cold, unforgiving depths of the castle once more. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the cries of the damned. Inside, Jonathan's heart pounded in time with his steps as he pushed forward, each moment slipping into the next like the passage of time through an hourglass. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps as he plunged deeper into the castle, ignoring the sharp pain in his side from an unseen cut. His mind whirled with a single, unyielding thought: find Mina. The echoes of the creature's last screech still vibrated through the stone walls, a reminder of the horrors that had been unleashed upon them. He stumbled, his hand brushing over the wall for support, feeling the rough, cold stone beneath his palm. The scent of damp and decay mixed with the iron tang of blood that clung to the air. He found himself at a massive double door, its intricate carvings depicting scenes of battles and banquets that had never been. The symbols glistened as if coated in sweat, shuddering under the weight of something more profound than just ancient craftsmanship. Pushing it open, he entered a grand hall that seemed to stretch on forever, a space where shadows twisted and flickered as if alive. And there she stood, Mina, her face framed by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the high, arched windows. But this was not the Mina he remembered. Her eyes were dull, empty sockets reflecting nothing but the void. Her lips moved, but no sound reached him, only the sickening, dry rasp of something scraping against stone. Mina! He shouted, his voice cracking. He sprinted forward, only to freeze when a deep, resonant voice echoed through the hall. Jonathan! The Count stepped forward from the shadows, his face impossibly youthful, eyes dark as the abyss itself. His presence exuded a chilling calm, his gaze fixed on Jonathan, who stood rooted to the spot, horror anchoring him. It's time to end this, Dracula whispered, his voice both mournful and triumphant. Time to claim what is mine. Jonathan clenched the sword tighter, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. He had to fight, for Mina, for the remnants of his own sanity. The room seemed to shift around him, the walls pulsating, closing in with each heartbeat. The air grew thick, each breath a struggle against suffocation. Dracula stepped forward, and with an inhuman speed, launched himself at Jonathan, a blur of black and crimson. Jonathan swung the sword with all the strength he could muster, the blade slicing through the darkness and catching Dracula across the chest. A roar like thunder shattered the silence as Dracula stumbled back, his form flickering as if caught between worlds. His eyes met Jonathan's for a moment, a flicker of recognition in them, of power, of rage, but something else, too, something like fear. Mina screamed, a sound that echoed off the cold stone and struck Jonathan's heart like a dagger. She fell to her knees, clutching at her chest as if trying to hold the shattered pieces together. Jonathan's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, the storm of desperation and despair in him stilled. Jonathan, please. Mina's voice was weak, yet filled with a haunting clarity. Save yourself. He couldn't. He wouldn't. With a newfound resolve, Jonathan lunged forward again, this time aiming for the Count's heart. Dracula's gaze met his once more, and for the first time, there was a fleeting moment of hesitation. But the moment passed, and the creature's form shifted, becoming more monstrous, eyes glistening with malice as he swept the sword aside and drove Jonathan to the ground. The pain was searing, a blaze that wrapped around his ribs, crackling like fire. Jonathan gasped, his vision dimming, and the shadows around him seemed to whisper, to claw at his soul. But he reached out, fingers closing around a stake that had fallen from Agatha's hand earlier in the fight. With a desperate surge, he plunged it into Dracula's heart. The Count let out a sound, half scream, half wail, that split the air. His body convulsed, twisting and turning as a dark, smoke-like essence leaked from his mouth, flooding the room with an unnatural, suffocating miasma. Dracula's body contorted one last time before dissolving into ash, falling in a slow cascade to the floor, leaving behind only the echoes of his tortured death. The room stilled, the pulse of the castle slowing, almost as if it, too, were breathing its last. Jonathan pushed himself up on trembling arms, his vision blurred. Mina, barely conscious, was sprawled on the cold stone. He reached for her, his fingers brushing against her skin, feeling the warmth return to her touch as the spell of the Count's influence broke. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with exhaustion and confusion. "Jonathan," she whispered, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "We're free." He couldn't answer, his chest still tight with the memory of what had just occurred. There was so much to say, so much to process, but for now, silence and the faint sound of the castle crumbling around them was all that mattered. The darkness outside, a mirror to the horror that had just unfolded, seemed to draw back, the clouds parting to reveal the pale light of dawn. They had survived, at least for now. But as Jonathan glanced at the shattered remnants of the great hall, a shiver of doubt passed over him. This was not the end. It couldn't be. And deep in the deepest shadow of his mind, something whispered that the nightmare was far from over.
Another tale of despair and dread unravels before us, weaving a tapestry of anguish and shadows. Let us tread carefully, for the heart of this story beats with the sorrow of the grave. The Shrouded Bell. I write these words not to seek absolution, but to leave behind a warning to any who may tread where I have. The events that haunt me began on the eve of my 27th year, in the dreary village of Blackthorn, where the skies always hung low, burdened by the weight of unfallen rain. I had taken residence in a crumbling manor inherited from a distant uncle whose name bore no fondness in my memory. The house loomed like a corpse unearthed, its timbers groaning with every breath of wind, its windows blind with grime. Yet, amidst its decay, I found the attic curiously pristine. There, hung from a beam, was a bell. The bell was small, no larger than my fist, and wrought of a peculiar metal, neither brass nor bronze, but something darker, almost black. Its surface was unmarked save for a single phrase etched into the lip: "The toll shall come for all." From the moment I saw it, an unease settled upon me. I resolved to remove it, but no tool could mar its tether. No hammer could break the beam, no blade could sever the rope. Defeated, I left the attic that first night, and as I descended, I swore I heard it chime, soft, fleeting, like the distant echo of morning. The days that followed were strange. Whispers seemed to rise from the very walls, voices murmuring just beyond the edge of understanding. I grew restless, plagued by dreams of shadowed figures, their faces obscured, their hands outstretched toward me as though in silent plea. I avoided the attic, though the bell's chime haunted me still, faint and intermittent. Yet no one else could hear it, not the caretaker who tended the grounds, nor the villagers who visited with reluctant curiosity. They claimed the bell was silent, but I knew better. It was on the 7th night that the dreams turned vivid. I saw the bell hanging in a void, swaying without cause, its toll reverberating through the dark like a heartbeat. Around it, a procession of figures walked in endless circles, their heads bowed, their hands clutching broken timepieces. One of them turned to me, a woman draped in tattered veils, her eyes hollow, her lips parted to reveal a mouth of shattered teeth. Her voice was a rasp, yet it struck me with clarity. "The toll shall come for all." I awoke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a war drum. Compelled by a force I could not name, I climbed to the attic, my lantern trembling in my grasp. The bell was swinging, though no breeze stirred the air. Its sound was louder now, resonant and deep, filling the room with a palpable vibration. I stood transfixed as the shadows on the walls began to shift and writhe, taking forms that mocked humanity, elongated limbs, twisted spines, faces contorted in agony. And then I saw her. The veiled woman stood at the center of the room, her hand outstretched toward me. Her presence was suffocating, her gaze piercing. "You have heard the toll," she said, her voice an unholy symphony of anguish and wrath. "It binds you now." I stumbled backward, my lantern falling and shattering. In the flickering light, the shadows surged, their limbs clawing at the air, their voices rising in a cacophony of despair. The woman stepped closer, her veil lifting to reveal a face that was not a face, empty and featureless, save for the imprint of countless hands pressed into the flesh. I fled the attic, sealing the door with every lock and nail I could find. Yet the bell's chime followed me, growing louder, more insistent. Days turned to weeks, and my sanity unraveled. I became a prisoner in my own home, consumed by the bell's relentless toll and the figures that now lurked in every shadow. It was the caretaker who found me, slumped against the attic door, my ears bleeding from the noise only I could hear. He tried to rouse me, but I was beyond reason. They took me to the village infirmary, where I remained in a state of near catatonia. Yet even there, the bell's toll haunted me, and I saw the veiled woman in every mirror, her faceless visage a reminder of my doom. The manor has since been abandoned, the attic sealed. Yet I know the bell remains, waiting for its next victim, its toll echoing in the void. And so I write these words, my final testament, for the toll shall come for all.
The cold, sterile air of the morgue seeped through the cracks of the old, cracked tiles, wrapping around the room like the long, skeletal fingers of an unseen hand. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting irregular shadows that twisted on the pale walls, dancing in grotesque patterns that defied logic. Thomas Wells stood at the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the surgical table before him. The body of a young woman lay there, her eyes wide open as if frozen in a moment of terror that no one else could see. It was the fifth body he'd encountered this week, each one with the same haunting expression, their faces contorted in fear, their bodies marked with the thin, ghostly scars of what he could only assume was their final moments. But it wasn't the look of death that rattled him. It was what came after. The whispers. "You're hearing things, Thomas," he muttered to himself, pinching the bridge of his nose as the room seemed to press in closer. The air grew heavier, pressing down like an unseen weight. The silence was deafening, filled only by the drip of a leaky pipe in the corner and the faint hum of the morgue's refrigeration unit. A noise, sharp and sudden, pulled him from his thoughts. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragged across the floor. He turned his head, eyes darting to the far end of the room, where the body of a man, garbed in a dark suit and tie, lay in an open drawer. His skin was pale, his expression frozen in a grotesque smile that seemed to mock Thomas. It was the look of someone who knew something, a secret that the living were never meant to hear. Thomas took a slow step forward, the squeak of his worn shoes loud in the empty space. He reached out to close the drawer, the metal cold beneath his fingers. As he pushed it shut, the scrape came again, louder now and closer. It was not the sound of a scuff or a creak. It was something clawing, desperate, like the scraping of a creature fighting its way out of a tomb. His heart pounded as he spun around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The lights flickered again, casting long, thin shadows that crept along the walls like inky fingers. He could have sworn he saw them move, shifting in a slow, serpentine dance that held a mocking, sinister rhythm. His vision blurred, the walls bending and warping, as though the very room itself was breathing. He forced himself to take a deep breath, squeezing his eyes shut and counting to 3. When he opened them again, the morgue was as it should be, clean, cold, silent. But the young woman on the table, her face frozen in an expression of horror, seemed to be looking at him now. It wasn't just her eyes. It was her entire being, as if she were alive and watching him from beyond the veil. "You're not alone," came a voice behind him, sharp and low. Thomas whirled around, his pulse racing as his eyes fell upon the figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a dark coat with a collar turned up against the chill. His hair was slicked back, but his eyes were what caught Thomas's attention. The eyes were hollow, deep wells that seemed to pull at the fabric of reality itself. Who are you?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, and with each movement, it seemed to pull the shadows around it tighter, as if swallowing the room whole. "Thomas," the voice spoke again, but this time, it was as if the words came from within his own mind. His vision blurred once more, and when it cleared, he found himself standing beside the table, staring down at the dead woman. The whispering grew louder, and this time, he could make out the words. "Join us," it called, soft and insidious. He tried to back away, but his body refused to move. The world tilted, spinning as he felt something icy grip his heart, pulling him into the darkness. He was falling, plunging into the unfathomable depths of an abyss where the light could never reach. A hand, cold as death, reached out and touched his cheek. And in that moment, Thomas knew that the whispers were not just in his mind. They were the voices of the dead, a chorus that had been waiting for him to listen. The hand that touched Thomas's cheek was unyielding, clammy, like the touch of a corpse pulled from the depths of its tomb. A shiver raced down his spine, and his body finally obeyed, ripping him from the moment of icy terror. He stumbled backward, his breath ragged and his heart pounding in his chest as though it might burst. The room seemed to tilt, shadows slithering across the walls like serpents, their shapes twisting and pulsing with a rhythm that was almost alive. Thomas blinked rapidly, the stinging in his eyes blurring the sight of the morgue. His hands grasped at his uniform, seeking something solid, something to tether him to the waking world. The figure at the edge of the room, that gaunt man with hollow eyes, remained still, watching him with an intensity that sent a cold spike of dread through his veins. It was as though time itself had stopped, caught between seconds, holding its breath for what was to come. The air grew colder, the silence deep and deafening. But then, amidst the tension, came the soft sound of a voice, a familiar voice. It was muffled, coming from somewhere close, and yet impossibly distant. It spoke his name, gentle yet insistent. "Thomas." He turned, eyes scanning the room for the source. The metal drawers lined the walls, their faceless fronts lined with the polished steel that reflected his wide, terror-filled eyes. The whispers rose, now a cacophony, overlapping and layering into a symphony of longing and malice. Each sound seemed to pull at the edge of his sanity, dragging him closer to the precipice. "Thomas, don't listen to them," the voice said again, clearer now. It was the voice of a woman, familiar, yet unsettling. He felt his pulse quicken as the realization struck him. It was Sarah, the night nurse who had disappeared 2 nights before. Her disappearance had been the talk of the staff, the hushed whispers in the break room, the concern in the eyes of the mortuary director. Now, it seemed as though she was here, speaking to him, though she was nowhere to be seen. "Sarah," he choked out, the name slipping from his lips as if it were a plea. "Where are you?" A cold laugh echoed in the darkness, and Thomas spun around to see the figure step forward. The man's lips curled into a grin, revealing teeth that were jagged and yellowed. He tilted his head, as if considering Thomas with newfound interest. "She can't help you, Thomas," the figure said, its voice a rasp like the rustle of dead leaves. "You have already heard us. Now you belong to us." The temperature dropped further, making Thomas's skin prickle with frost. His teeth chattered, and he forced himself to focus, to resist the terror that threatened to consume him. He clutched his arms tightly, as though that might ward off the icy grip closing in around him. "Why are you here? What do you want?" Thomas shouted, his voice barely audible over the chorus of whispers. The man in the dark coat stepped forward, the dim light catching on the long, pale fingers of his outstretched hand. "You know why, Thomas? The dead have stories to tell, and we need someone who will listen." As the words sank in, Thomas realized that he could see shapes now, figures beginning to appear in the dim light, emerging from the dark corners of the room. They were the dead, the bodies he had seen brought into the morgue, their faces twisted in agony and sorrow. Their eyes, wide and pleading, locked with his, as if to accuse him of the silence that had kept them in their prison of death. And then he heard it, a voice not his own, but one that resonated in the back of his mind. It was soft and chilling. Listen. He gripped his head, the air around him closing in. He could feel the stories, the histories, the terrible moments that had been stitched into the lives of the dead, flooding his senses. Voices of children, men, and women blended into a singular roar. He stumbled backward, only to collide with the cold, steel edge of a drawer. The dead were speaking, but their words were not of their own deaths. They spoke of their lives, their sorrows, their fears. Each story burrowed into him, sinking deep into the marrow of his bones, pulling him down into the dark, where no light could follow. In that moment, he understood what they wanted from him. An audience, a vessel to carry their stories, their curses, to the world beyond the morgue walls. The whispers grew louder, sharper, and the figure in the dark coat took a step closer, his eyes now reflecting Thomas's own terror. "We will make you remember. We will make you a part of us." Thomas's vision blurred as the room erupted in a cacophony of wails. He could not scream, for his voice had been stolen, lost among the chorus of the dead. The chaos around him coalesced into an almost tangible force, an unrelenting current that swept through the room. Thomas's body felt weightless, as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. The whispers in his ears shifted, turning from indistinct mutters to guttural chants, a language older than the walls that surrounded them. The dead reached out to him, their cold, skeletal fingers grazing his skin, leaving behind an icy burn that spread like fire. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His vision blurred until it was a smeared painting of writhing shadows. His heart felt as if it were being crushed under the weight of the room, a suffocating pressure that threatened to shatter his ribcage. "Thomas!" Sarah's voice screamed from somewhere above the din, but it was no longer comforting. It was desperate, raw, a plea that resonated with the pain of the souls surrounding him. With a surge of strength he didn't know he possessed, Thomas reached out, his hand grasping the nearest drawer. It was cold to the touch, sending a shiver up his spine. His eyes fell on the name tag affixed to its surface, a name he knew too well, Sarah. The drawer was pulled open from within, as if an invisible force had triggered the mechanism. The body of the night nurse, pale and still, emerged with a slow, mechanical motion. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted as though she were about to speak, but the silence that followed was deafening. A bead of sweat slid down Thomas's temple, and for a moment, he dared to hope she would awaken, that this was all some horrific nightmare. Then she opened her eyes. They were hollow, dark pools, devoid of life but filled with a kind of understanding that sent a chill down his spine. Thomas fell back, scrambling away from her as her head tilted in his direction. A ghostly hand lifted, fingers trailing the air, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he thought she would touch him. But instead, she spoke. "Listen," Sarah whispered, the sound cutting through the confusion. "It's not just the dead who speak. It's you, too. They want you to remember." The room spun, the walls seeming to breathe in and out as the whispers turned to screams. Thomas tried to force his body to move, to run, to flee, but his limbs refused to obey. The air around him grew colder, the silence in the room thickening until it was nearly suffocating. The figure in the dark coat advanced, stepping over bodies that seemed to writhe and shift as if they were alive, all eyes locked on Thomas. His lips pulled back in a smile that seemed to stretch too far, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. The voice that escaped his mouth was not his own, but one that carried centuries of agony and regret. "You have to listen, Thomas. You have to understand why you're here." With every word, the room grew darker, the whispers now a chorus of agony that pressed against his mind. The figures around him began to sway, their once human shapes now contorted and grotesque, each one carrying a story that had been suppressed, a dark truth that demanded to be heard. Thomas's vision flickered, and for a moment, he saw himself, long before he had ever stepped foot in the morgue. He was a young boy, playing in the yard of a house that seemed familiar but was drenched in shadows. A voice, sweet and soothing, called to him, and he turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was his mother, her face radiant, her hand outstretched. "Come, Thomas. It's time to go." The memories crashed into him, raw and unfiltered. The scent of damp earth, the sting of tears, the tremble of fear as the darkness closed in. And then he knew the morgue was not just a place for the dead. It was a place where echoes of the past converged, where stories and souls were trapped, unable to move on. And he, Thomas, had been chosen as the vessel to carry their voices. The shadowy figure leaned closer, the smile on his lips stretching wider until it seemed to split his face in two. His eyes bored into Thomas's, hollow and knowing. "Your mother, Thomas. She's here. She has always been here. And now, you'll tell her story." The whispers swelled again, but now they were joined by the voice of a child. A voice so familiar it made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. "Thomas." He turned to see Sarah's ghostly figure standing at the center of the room, surrounded by the others, her eyes filled with both sorrow and understanding. The weight of it all pressed on him, threatening to crush him with the force of forgotten memories. He realized then that the only way to survive was to listen, to hear their stories, to become a part of the chorus that would echo long after the morgue's doors were sealed shut. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, the question hanging in the air as the room fell silent. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face as he prepared himself for the truth he had spent his life trying to avoid. The dead were speaking, and it was time to listen. The silence in the room became almost tangible, pressing in on Thomas as if it were made of lead. The flickering lights cast jagged shadows across the walls, shifting in time with the thrumming beat of his heart. He looked at Sarah, her figure more solid now, as if the very act of remembering had given her strength. "Do you remember?" she whispered, her voice fragile, as if the air itself might shatter it. Thomas's mind reeled, racing through the fractured memories that had long been buried. The voice of his mother still echoed in his ears, the sound of her laughter intertwined with the deep, resonant calls of the forest. He could feel the tug of that forgotten past, drawing him in, unraveling the tightly wound fabric of his life. "I remember," he said, his voice trembling. His eyes flicked back to the shadowy figure that had once been a man. It now stood at the edge of the room, unmoving, watching him with a hunger that was both chilling and familiar. The whispers in the room shifted, carrying the weight of stories untold. Thomas could now make out snatches of dialogue, fragments of pain and betrayal, a cacophony that had built up over lifetimes. Each sound wove together, and he felt the words pressing against his mind, as if trying to force their way out. His fingers tightened into fists, nails biting into his palms. "Tell us," a voice urged, its tone as dry as the cracks in an ancient tomb. "Tell the story, Thomas. Only then will the weight be lifted." Thomas's eyes darted around the room, catching sight of the faces of the dead. The man with the crooked smile, the woman whose neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, the child with hollow, unblinking eyes. They all seemed to lean in, waiting, desperate for the release that only he could provide. I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice cracking with the strain. A figure in a long, tattered coat stepped forward from the crowd. The eyes were deep and dark, like a bottomless well, and Thomas recognized him at once. It was the man from the dream, the one whose voice had been echoing in his head since he had first entered the morgue. This man was not a part of the dead, but rather an enigma, a wraith with a purpose. "You start where it all began," the figure said, his voice soft, almost coaxing. "The stories you buried, the truths you forgot." Thomas's vision blurred as memories surged to the surface, breaking through the dam of denial he had built around them. He remembered the night he had found the first body in the woods, the cold, lifeless form of his childhood friend. The search parties, the whispers of the townsfolk, the rumors of the cursed morgue that had existed long before he'd ever set foot inside it. He remembered the warnings he'd ignored and the way the town had shunned him once they found out he worked in the very place that housed the dead. They said the morgue was cursed, he murmured, barely able to keep his voice steady. They said it held more than just bodies. A deep, resonant chuckle sounded behind him, startling him. Thomas spun around to see the figure in the long coat, who now stood just a few feet away, closer than he should have been possible. His grin widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too white. They were right, the figure said, his voice rich with malice. "It holds stories, and it holds secrets. And you, Thomas, have been the keeper of them all." The room seemed to pulse with the energy of the dead. The whispers escalated, a cacophony that seemed to turn the walls inward. Thomas felt his body shaking, his breath caught in his throat as if the very air around him had turned to stone. The memories came faster now, filling him with dread. The blood-stained altar hidden deep within the morgue's foundation, the old book of rites, the ritual that had brought him here in the first place. "You knew what you were doing when you opened that book," the figure continued, stepping closer until only inches separated them. "You invited them in, Thomas. And now, they're ready to tell their stories. The only question is, are you?" Thomas's lips quivered as he tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He was no longer in control of the situation, no longer the man who had been tasked with cataloging the dead. He was the center of their attention, the thread that wove them all together. He had become the conduit for their tales, the link between the dead and the living. "Help me," Sarah whispered from across the room, her figure now more distinct, more defined. A single tear traced a path down her pale cheek as she raised a hand to him. He reached out, but his hand trembled so violently that he nearly fell. The figures around him closed in, their movements quickening like the rush of wind before a storm. He was surrounded, trapped in a maelstrom of memories and shadows, each of them demanding to be heard, each of them clawing at his sanity. Thomas knew then that he was about to speak the truth that would release them all, or damn him forever. The room darkened, the once warm light flickering out and leaving only the glow of ghostly luminescence that seemed to emanate from the eyes of the dead. Thomas's heart drummed a frantic beat, and his fingers spasmed, seeking something solid to hold on to. But there was nothing but the oppressive silence and the sharp, hollow sounds of the figures shifting closer, closing in like a storm. "Tell them," the voice commanded, the man in the tattered coat stepping forward, his eyes as deep and black as a void. His grin remained, but it was no longer a grin of amusement. It was a grimace of expectation. "Tell them the story that binds you to this place." Thomas's mouth opened, but no sound emerged at first. The memories tumbled into him, a torrent he could not control. He was drowning, struggling to pull them out from the depths of his consciousness, to weave the fragments into a tale that would free him. His eyes fell on Sarah, who watched him with an intensity that seemed to scorch him from within. "It was the night he came," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. He felt the air shift, as if the morgue itself were leaning in, listening. The air grew colder, each breath a painful effort, as if the room were siphoning away his very warmth. The shadows in the corners of the room quivered, taking on the shapes of memories that Thomas had long since buried. He could see himself in the woods, a child with dirt-streaked cheeks, the forest so dark it seemed to hold its breath. He remembered the stories his grandmother had told him, the warning in her voice as she spoke of the cursed place where the dead whispered. The story of the morgue, built upon ground saturated with the blood of those who had come before. The forgotten ritual that had been carried out in secret, binding the souls of the departed to the land, to the stone walls, to the living who dared to disturb them. He closed his eyes and let the story spill forth, the voice in his head urging him on. "There was a man who came to this place, a man whose name I don't remember. He brought with him a book, old and cracked, with pages that seemed to bleed when touched. The book whispered in the night, voices only the foolish dared to listen to. And so he read. He read the words of summoning, of binding, words that summoned not just the dead, but the soul of the place itself. The figures in the room began to move in unison, their limbs twisting and contorting like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. Thomas could feel their hunger, their thirst for release, their need to be heard. The whispers rose around him, but he pressed on, not daring to pause. But the summoning was never meant to be complete. The man who read the words did not understand the price. When the ritual was done, the dead did not depart. They remained, bound to the living, feeding on them, whispering their stories and demands. The curse took root, and I was the one who was left to guard it. I was the keeper of their silence. His voice faltered, a shudder passing through him as he glanced at Sarah. She nodded, tears shining in the dim light, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. It was almost enough to push back the shadows, to make him feel real again. Almost. "You've bound yourself to the curse, Thomas," Sarah said, her voice no longer broken, but sharp, unwavering. "You're the keeper. You're the key to their freedom." The figures around him grew still, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions an eerie mirror of his own horror. He realized, with a sudden, heart-stopping clarity, that the story he was telling was not just for them. It was for him. It was a confession, a reckoning, the twisted truth that would determine whether he was a savior or a damned soul. He reached out, his hands trembling as they fell upon the cold, metal table beside him. The figures began to whisper, their voices louder now, echoing in the cavernous room. And then, suddenly, one voice cut through the chaos, a voice that felt like a serrated knife slicing through the fog. "You must choose, Thomas. Tell them the final piece, and the curse will be lifted." Thomas's breath caught as he looked at the man in the long coat, who now moved behind him like a shadow given form. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing on him, the darkness that promised oblivion if he did not speak. The room began to twist and shift, the walls seeming to breathe in time with his panic. Sarah's form flickered like a dying flame, her face a mixture of love and despair. "Tell them everything," she whispered, "before it's too late." Thomas took a shuddering breath, the final confession poised on his lips. Would he free the souls and free himself, or would he seal his fate, becoming just another voice among the lost? The room seemed to collapse inward, the walls pulsating with each beat of his faltering heart. Thomas's vision blurred, the figures around him becoming a storm of limbs and twisted features. He felt his life slipping, the air seeping out of his lungs as if it were being siphoned away. The whispering grew louder, a chorus that burrowed into his brain, and he knew that if he spoke the final words, he would lose himself forever. Sister Agatha's voice echoed in his ears, though she was not there. It was a memory, a ghostly echo of an old lesson. The price of knowing is paid in blood, and the cost of redemption is your soul. He had paid enough, he realized. Enough to know that this was not just about freeing the dead, but about confronting what he had become, what he had allowed to happen. The room darkened, the shadowy figures forming into a single, monstrous shape. It towered above him, its limbs writhing like the roots of an ancient, cursed tree. The face that emerged was distorted, with eyes that burned like coals and a mouth that seemed to split the air in two. It was the manifestation of the curse itself, of the sins that had started long before Thomas had taken the first step into this place. It had no name, but in his mind, Thomas heard it, the Keeper of Echoes. "You have brought us here," it whispered, the voice seeping into his bones, making him shiver. He could feel the reality around him straining, the air growing thick and suffocating. It pressed on his chest, urging him to collapse. Yet, he stood, or tried to, leaning heavily on the table as blood dripped from the corner of his mouth. "I never meant for this," Thomas croaked, his voice breaking as he tried to catch his breath. His fingers fumbled for the scalpel, the one he had dropped earlier when the first whispers had started. It felt like an eternity since then, like he had been here, on the edge of madness, for a lifetime. The figure's grin twisted, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "The price of silence is your life, but the price of truth is your soul." Thomas took a step forward, his vision swimming. The figure stepped closer, the ground quaking beneath its weight, and the world around them trembled as if in sympathy. The bodies on the tables shivered, their limbs twitching as if they were alive, yearning to move, to reach out. "Tell them, Thomas," the figure whispered, its voice low and laced with malice. "Tell them the price of salvation." He shuddered, the cold seeping into his bones as the room filled with the echoes of the past. Images flashed before him, the man with the book, the ghastly ritual, the cries of the souls trapped within the stone walls of the morgue. It had all started so long ago, with a reckless wish and a whispered promise that had condemned him to this. Sarah's face appeared in the midst of the darkness, her eyes wide with fear, yet full of an unyielding resolve. He could see her, barely, in the faint light. And then the air shifted, the dead moving as if they were preparing for something. their silence broken by an ancient chant that resonated from within their hollow chests. Thomas's hands tightened around the scalpel, blood slicking his fingers, yet he did not let go. "Don't let them have you," Sarah whispered, though her voice seemed to be coming from far away. "Fight, Thomas. Fight for us." The room seemed to tremble as he brought the blade to his chest, his heart pounding so hard that he thought it might shatter his ribs. The Keeper of Echoes, if that was what it was, watched with eyes like burning holes in the dark, waiting for him to make the final sacrifice. "You're too late," Thomas muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's already over." The Keeper's grin deepened, impossibly wide, as it stepped closer, the heat of its presence a suffocating weight against his chest. "Not yet. You will speak, or you will die." Thomas took a deep, ragged breath, feeling the sharp edge of the scalpel pressing into his skin. He could feel his soul being pulled, thread by thread, into the abyss of shadows that surrounded him. But a flicker of defiance sparked in his eyes. This was not the end he had envisioned. There was still time, just a little, to say what needed to be said. The whispers in his mind urged him on, the memory of his grandmother's voice clearer than ever. "You are the keeper of the silence, Thomas. You are the one who can break the curse." The Keeper's form quivered, its shadowed limbs bending and contorting as Thomas's defiance sparked a reaction. The air crackled like thunder, a palpable wave of power building up in the suffocating gloom. Thomas's vision began to dim, but the fire in his heart burned brighter than ever. He clutched the scalpel tighter, feeling the cold steel bite into his skin as if reminding him of the price that had been paid. "You cannot silence me," Thomas whispered, his voice strained, barely audible above the shuddering of the room. The Keeper's eyes flared, the intensity in them growing. The whispers grew louder, splitting into hundreds of voices that crawled under his skin, each one speaking the secrets Thomas had spent his life trying to bury. "Let them be heard," the Keeper roared, its voice a shuddering, guttural resonance that echoed off the stone walls. The morgue was now alive, a living organism throbbing with the pulse of the long dead. Thomas felt the chill seep deeper into his bones, and yet he felt alive in a way he had never known. The truth he had feared so long was there, clawing at the edges of his mind, demanding to be set free. He looked at the figure before him, the monstrous reflection of everything he had become. It was not just a creature of darkness, it was the embodiment of his guilt, his choices, and the silent screams of those who had come before him. "Tell them," the Keeper said, its voice a twisting wind, desperate and insatiable. "Tell them the curse, the promise." Thomas's chest heaved, each breath a battle, but he fought through it. His hand, shaking and drenched in blood, raised the scalpel and pointed it at the creature. "The price of silence is death," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "But the price of truth is redemption." The Keeper recoiled, its expression shifting from triumph to terror. The shadows that clung to its form seemed to pull back, hesitant and wary. Thomas pushed forward, feeling the pressure in his chest as if his very heart were about to burst. The morgue screamed in agony, the dead turning on their tables, their mouths opening in silent, twisted wails. "Let them speak," Thomas cried, his voice cutting through the din. "Let them know their stories." A silence followed, but not one of peace. It was the silence of something unseen, an absence that gripped the room like a vice. The Keeper's form flickered, its limbs pulling in on themselves as though they were dissolving into the darkness. The air stilled, the whispers quieted, and for a moment, Thomas dared to believe that the curse would be broken. But the feeling was fleeting. A cold, guttural laugh broke the silence, deep and resonant. The Keeper's form re-emerged, but this time it was different. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, and the figure that had been so distorted now held a shape that was unmistakably human, yet monstrous in its perfection. It was no longer just an entity of darkness but something far more terrifying. The first of the lost souls, now made flesh. Thomas's legs wobbled beneath him as the Keeper advanced. The grotesque beauty of its form, the way its mouth twisted into an impossible smile, was a mockery of what was human. Thomas's mind screamed to flee, but his body betrayed him, rooted to the spot by the weight of his choices and the power of the curse he had unleashed. "Do you see?" it whispered, stepping into the pool of light that had crept from a crack in the ceiling. "You have awakened us all, Thomas. Now, you will see the price of the truth." The room seemed to implode around him, the echoes of voices intertwining with the hiss of the shadows. The morgue, once a place of cold, indifferent death, became a stage of unspeakable horror, a chorus of suffering, each note a thread that pulled at the fabric of his sanity. Thomas opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was choked by the grip of the curse closing around his throat. The keeper reached for him, fingers tipped with claws that shimmered like obsidian, and the light from above flickered as if it too was dying. "Do you know now what it means to be free?" it asked, eyes wide and filled with a dark, sorrowful understanding. And as Thomas's vision blurred, darkness crept in, his final breath snatched by the unrelenting horror he had woken. The room fell silent, the whispers snuffed out as if they had never been. The keeper, now a grotesque, radiant figure with eyes that shone like molten gold, stood in the center of the morgue, the embodiment of anguish and unfulfilled promises. It turned its gaze to Thomas, who was crumpled on the cold, tiled floor, a shadow of his former self. The echoes of his final, shuddering breath seemed to reverberate through the walls, a sound that would forever haunt the silence. But the keeper did not stop there. It stretched out a hand, translucent and gleaming, toward the lifeless body, and the air thickened, charged with the weight of 1,000 broken souls. The moment Thomas's heart stilled, a sudden pulse of light exploded from his chest, and the keeper was forced to retreat, a howl of rage and recognition splitting the night. Thomas's body, as if pulled by an invisible thread, arched upward, the very essence of his being fighting against the weight of the darkness. For a moment, it seemed as though the curse had failed, that he would be released from this waking nightmare. But it was not freedom that followed. No, it was something worse. The light that had momentarily illuminated the room twisted and darkened, spreading like ink in water. It seeped from Thomas's body, forming into jagged shapes and contorted forms, the silent screams of the departed. The keeper shrieked as the darkness returned to it, the golden light in its eyes dimming. It whispered, "You are bound to us now, Thomas, and the silence shall be broken." As the creatures within the morgue began to awaken, shifting and moving, their eyes voids of agony, Thomas felt his very soul being pulled apart. The lines between life and death blurred, and he was trapped in a liminal space, neither fully human nor entirely spirit. The keeper, now bound to him by the broken promise, stepped forward, its form shimmering with dark, regal power. Thomas's consciousness splintered, an overwhelming wave of memories flooding his mind. The echoes of those who had once breathed, spoken, and died within these walls. Their voices merged into a cacophony, filling his ears with stories of betrayal, torment, and loss. And with every voice, every memory, he grew weaker, his very existence unraveling like a frayed thread. But within the web of darkness, Thomas found one fragment of clarity. He could still remember who he was, what he had come to seek, and what had been sacrificed to awaken this horror. The keeper had known his weakness and had used it against him, but now Thomas knew his strength. It was the truth, a truth that had been silenced by death and decay, but not destroyed. As the keeper reached out, a final act of defiance coursed through Thomas. His voice, fragile but defiant, broke through the mournful wails and the shifting, dark tides. "I will not be silenced," he said, eyes locked with the keeper's, his soul staring back at the abyss. "Not now. Not ever." The keeper hesitated, a tremor in its form. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, as if the world itself held its breath. And then, in an eruption that tore the shadows from their moorings, Thomas's voice became the voice of all those who had been forgotten, their stories rising as one. The keeper screeched, disintegrating into a storm of darkness and light. It was not the end, but it was a beginning, a new chapter written not in blood, but in defiance. The morgue, once an abyss, now lay still, a silence heavy with something new. Thomas, no longer fully mortal, no longer bound by the curse, stood among the shattered remnants of what had once been. He was not whole, but he was free, at least for now. As the dawn broke, streaming through the cracked ceiling, Thomas turned to face the rising sun, its light like a promise on the edge of the world. He knew that whatever lay ahead would not be simple, but he would no longer be alone. The voices of the dead, his newfound allies, whispered behind him, their mournful lament softened by a flicker of hope. And in the distance, unseen yet felt, the Keeper watched from beyond the threshold of the living, knowing that its silence would not hold forever. The moon was a ghostly wisp, barely illuminating the tombstones that stood like solemn sentinels in the cemetery of Wycliffe Hollow. The air was heavy, suffused with the scent of earth and decay, and the silence was broken only by the distant hoot of an owl, its call echoing through the hollow and setting the crows to squawking in nervous agitation. Elias Devereux, the town's new gravekeeper, stood at the edge of the cemetery, staring into the labyrinth of tombs and mausoleums. He had come to this job out of necessity. His father had been a man who believed in duty above all, and in the town of Wycliffe, that duty was to care for the dead. Yet Elias had not anticipated the weight of the job, the oppressive sense of being watched, or the persistent murmurs that seemed to echo through the cracked headstones when the wind stirred. A handbell rang from the direction of the main road, its clang a sharp reminder of the late hour. It was time for the nightly check of the graves, though Elias had never been accustomed to the rituals of those who worked the graveyard shift. He forced his tired legs to move, the gravel beneath his boots whispering in the darkness. As he passed a cluster of ancient, leaning stones, he noticed one that seemed different, newer, yet worn as if it had weathered years in the span of days. It was not a tombstone but a marker, inscribed with only a name, Miriam Ashby. The name stirred something within him, a distant memory he couldn't quite place. He leaned closer, the scent of damp earth and moss clinging to the edges of his senses, and his eyes traced the carved letters. A chill raced down his spine. The ground beneath Miriam Ashby's marker had shifted, cracked open to reveal the deep, black void of the grave. Elias stepped back, heart pounding. It was an unsettling thing, the thought that a grave could be disturbed without reason. Yet, the silence was broken when the wind carried with it a faint, sorrowful whisper. "Help me!" The voice was weak, a spectral sound that floated above the rustle of the leaves and sent shivers along Elias's arms. He glanced nervously around, the thin beams of moonlight barely piercing the thick brambles and ivy that twisted like veins through the old stones. The grave beside Miriam Ashby's marker opened wider, as if in response, and a pale, bony hand broke through, clutching at the air with desperate, tremulous fingers. Elias's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body remained frozen, rooted in place by an unspoken dread. The hand withdrew, followed by the thin, emaciated figure of a woman who seemed more specter than flesh. Her eyes, hollow and wide, locked with his, and Elias felt the weight of her gaze seep into him, probing, seeking. "You shouldn't have come," she rasped, her voice cracked and raw. The whisper came again, this time louder, as if she were speaking not just to him but to the darkness itself. "You should have stayed away." Elias forced himself to move, stumbling backward, heart hammering. The woman's form seemed to twitch, flickering as if caught between this world and the next. Then, suddenly, she was gone, leaving only the echo of her words in the still night air. And then the cemetery was silent once more. But silence, Elias realized, had become a living thing, breathing and shifting, crawling along the edges of the graveyard like a sentient fog. The ground at Miriam Ashby's grave was no longer merely cracked. It was now seething, churning as if it were alive. A low moan shuddered through the air. He turned and fled, stumbling past rows of stone markers that seemed to lean toward him as if in curiosity, their inscriptions blurred by the tears forming in his eyes. But behind him, something moved, 1,000 whispers combining into a cacophony, one voice leading them all. The night never ends in Wycliffe Hollow. Elias ran blindly, the ground beneath him slick with damp moss and the gnarled roots of ancient trees that clawed at his boots. The moon, now half hidden behind the thick, brooding clouds, cast jagged shadows that seemed to reach out and grab him. The wind whispered with a voice of its own, taunting him, brushing against his face like cold fingers. "Help me!" The voice followed him, drifting through the graveyard with a hollow, pitiful wail. He dared not turn back, for fear that he might see that spectral figure, Miriam Ashby, slithering behind him like a snake. The only thing that kept him moving was the desperate need to escape, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the horrors of Wycliffe Hollow. He reached the boundary, where the tall wrought iron fence stood, rusted and twisted as if it had been bent by unseen hands. The gate was ajar, creaking on its hinges as though it too were reluctant to let him pass. Without hesitation, Elias slipped through the opening and stumbled into the safety of the narrow path that led to the town. His heart still pounded in his chest, every beat a drum of dread. But as he ran, the whispering grew louder until it became a chorus of voices, each more distorted and desperate than the last. "Elias, come back. You can't leave." He paused for a heartbeat, eyes darting behind him, but the cemetery was now a dark, yawning chasm in the distance. Shadows danced like wraiths, and the mist coiled at the edges as if waiting. He pushed forward, breath coming in ragged gasps, until he reached the stone bridge that arched over the river Blackthorn. The water surged beneath him, black as ink, reflecting the thin, shivering light of the moon. The road to Wycliffe was deserted. Not even the dogs barked, and the birds had long since abandoned their songs. Silence, thick and suffocating, pressed down on Elias as he crossed the bridge. The weight of what had just happened gripped him like an iron band. He couldn't shake the image of Miriam Ashby's hollow eyes, or the way the ground had moved, restless as if it were alive. Reaching the first houses of the town, he knocked desperately at doors, the old wood shuddering under his frantic pounding. One by one, lights flicked on, and faces appeared in windows, creased with sleep and confusion. But it was the face of the old apothecary, Mr. Tallow, that made Elias stop cold. The old man's eyes, sunken and dark as a storm cloud, held a secret that only fear could unlock. "It's begun, hasn't it?" Mr. Tallow whispered, opening the door with a slow, shivering hand. His voice cracked, as though it were being forced through a throat that hadn't spoken in years. Elias stepped inside, breathing heavily, and Mr. Tallow closed the door behind him, peering out through the narrow crack. "Wycliffe has long been haunted by the dead that refuse rest," Mr. Tallow said. His words dripped with a melancholy that turned Elias's blood to ice. "But this is worse. She was never meant to return." "Who? What are you talking about?" Elias's voice broke, the weight of exhaustion and terror nearly sending him to his knees. "Miriam Ashby," Mr. Tallow said, his gaze flicking to the darkened window where a shadow seemed to shift. "She was not meant to rise, but now she has. The curse of Wycliffe is stirring again, and once it's begun, it cannot be stopped." Before Elias could ask what the curse was, the faint sound of a bell echoed from the direction of the cemetery, distant and mournful. The sound was followed by a screech that made Elias's hair stand on end. A sound that was neither human nor animal, but something deep and primal. The old man's eyes widened, and he grabbed Elias by the wrist. His grip was strong despite his frail form. "We must go to the hollow," he said, urgency flaring in his voice. "If we don't, the town will be lost." Elias didn't understand, but his instincts screamed at him to listen. He nodded, and together they slipped out the back of Mr. Tallow's house, moving swiftly through the empty streets. The night swallowed them whole, and with it, the silence deepened. It wasn't long before they reached the path that led back to the cemetery, but the ground felt different now. It was as though the earth had grown heavy with an unseen burden, whispering secrets that no human was meant to know. A voice whispered in the wind, thin and hollow. "You came back, Elias. Now it begins." The fog thickened around them, curling and twisting like a living thing as they made their way deeper into the cemetery. The shadows cast by the tombstones seemed to shift and dance, forming shapes that flickered just beyond the edge of Elias's vision. Mr. Tallow, with his thin, gnarled hands and sharp, fearful eyes, led the way, the hem of his worn coat trailing in the dew-soaked grass. "Stay close," Mr. Tallow said, his voice low and strained. This place holds more than just the dead. It holds the spirits of those who never found peace. And Miriam, she is their queen. Elias's heart thudded in his chest, each beat feeling like it might burst through his ribs. He glanced nervously at the tombstones, each bearing names he knew, names of people who had lived simple, quiet lives in Wycliffe. Yet now, their silent, unyielding gravestones seemed to bear witness to something dark and ancient. The first shriek came from behind them, piercing the night and sending a shiver racing down Elias's spine. He turned to see nothing but the blanched moonlight filtering through the skeletal branches above. But then, at the far end of the clearing, where the old oak trees grew twisted and monstrous, something stirred. It was a figure, tall and swathed in the black of midnight, with eyes that burned like coals. It was not Miriam, but a spirit far more sinister, its mouth open in an unearthly cry. Elias stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a half-buried stone. "Keep moving," Mr. Tallow urged, his voice cracking with terror as he dragged Elias toward the hollow. The earth beneath their feet trembled, shuddering as if it were alive. The wind carried a foul, metallic scent, mingled with the sharp, bitter tang of earth. A distant, guttural growl resonated through the clearing, echoing between the tombstones and rustling the tall, sickly grass. Elias's skin prickled, and he dared not look back. His legs ached with exhaustion, but the fear gave him an adrenaline-fueled surge. They reached the edge of the hollow, where the graves were older even than the town itself, and the air felt heavy, damp with the power of an ancient curse. "Here," Mr. Tallow whispered, pulling Elias behind a broken, moss-covered wall that once marked the boundary of an old chapel. It was dark here, cloaked by the branches of the trees and the ever-thickening mist. They were silent now, each breath ragged and shallow as they waited. The distant shrieks and howls continued, but here, in the eerie stillness of the hollow, there was a different sound, a soft, resonant thud, as if someone were tapping against the earth with a skeletal hand. Elias's gaze darted to the ground, where the soil seemed to shift and shudder, as though something were moving beneath it. "She's here," Mr. Tallow said, his voice barely audible, but his eyes were wide, filled with the terror of a man who knew what was coming. "You must understand, Elias. Miriam was never meant to return to this world. When the dead refuse rest, they become something else, something more. The curse feeds on their anguish and grows stronger with every soul it claims." Before Elias could respond, a hand burst from the earth at their feet, pale and bony, covered in mud and grime. He gasped, stumbling backward as the soil cracked and splintered, forming a grotesque fissure that sent tremors across the ground. From the gaping hole, a figure began to pull itself free. It was Miriam, but not the Miriam Elias remembered. Her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. Her face was pale, fractured with veins that pulsed like dark rivers, and her mouth twisted into a smile that revealed teeth sharper than any human's. "You came back," she whispered, the sound a chorus of voices that made Elias's head spin. "But it's too late." The wind howled, a cacophony of screams and laughter that seemed to come from all directions. Elias's heart pounded so violently he thought it might shatter his ribs. He glanced at Mr. Tallow, whose face was etched with grief and resignation. "Run, Elias!" Mr. Tallow shouted, stepping forward as the ground beneath him began to split. The earth roared, sending a wave of darkness surging toward them, and Miriam's laughter echoed in the night, twisting and turning into something monstrous and unholy. Elias's legs felt as if they were made of lead, but he forced himself to move, stumbling backward as the black surge from the ground enveloped Mr. Tallow. The old man's eyes met Elias's for a fleeting moment, an expression of both regret and defiance in them, before he was swallowed by the tide of shadow and disappeared into the abyss. Miriam's hollow eyes fixed on Elias, and for an instant, he could see the reflection of his own terror within them. "Run!" Mr. Tallow's voice roared from somewhere deep within the writhing, whispering darkness. But it was too late. The ground beneath Elias shuddered and cracked, sending plumes of cold, damp earth up into the air. He turned and ran, blindly sprinting through the labyrinth of graves and tombstones, the choking mist clinging to him like the fingers of the dead. Behind him, the shrieks rose to a fever pitch, and he felt as if 1,000 unseen eyes were watching, always just out of reach. The moon, pale and thin as a shard of bone, cast its light over the chaos, illuminating grotesque figures rising from the soil, half-formed and writhing like the dead waking from eternal sleep. Their mouths opened, but instead of cries, they whispered in a voice that made Elias's skin crawl. He stumbled into an old mausoleum, its stone door cracked and lichen-covered. He slammed his shoulder against it, forcing it open just enough to slip inside. The air within was thick, stagnant with the scent of decay and old, forgotten tombs. Shaking, he pushed the door shut and fell to the cold, stone floor, gasping for breath. In the shadows, a soft, rhythmic tapping began, like the sound of fingernails scraping against marble. Elias scrambled to his feet, heart hammering in his chest, and strained to listen. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was joined by a chorus of whispers that seemed to slither through the air, as if the walls themselves were alive. "You should not have come," a voice rasped. It was Miriam's voice, but deeper, threaded with a vibration that set Elias's teeth on edge. He backed up until his heels hit the cold, rough wall, and he craned his neck to see a figure standing in the darkness of the mausoleum. She emerged slowly, her form like smoke, shifting and twisting, with eyes that glowed as bright as embers. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice weaving through the cracks in the air like a serpent. "You brought this upon yourself." Elias opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He was paralyzed, unable to move as Miriam stepped closer, her presence a suffocating wave of icy dread. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, and the walls of the mausoleum started to crack and splinter, revealing the bone-white roots of trees that had crept through the stone and into the space like skeletal fingers. Her hand reached out, but it was not the delicate, familiar touch he remembered. It was cold, covered in dark veins and twisted like a branch twisted by rot. He stumbled back, but his foot caught on something. A broken urn that lay in a pool of dried roses, its lid shattered. The moment the urn fell, a whisper, barely audible, rushed through the room. Elias could swear he heard Mr. Tallow's voice, an echo that spoke only one word: "Run." He turned and bolted toward the cracked door of the mausoleum, the whispers rising to a maddening cacophony. But it wasn't just Miriam's voice now. It was joined by many others, the lost souls that had risen from their graves, those who had been taken and kept by the dark. They were now with her, their voices singing in a chorus of horror, pleading and warning. Elias reached for the door, but the shadows leapt at him like living beings, clawing at his flesh, their touch cold and painful. He screamed, fighting against them, but they wrapped around him, tugging him into the dark. "Help!" he cried, reaching out to the door, which was now slipping away from him, out of reach. The last thing he heard was Miriam's voice, soft as silk but layered with malevolence. As she whispered, "It is too late for you. It is too late for all of us." The darkness wrapped around Elias, pulling him into the abyss, and he felt as though he were being torn apart by 1,000 invisible blades. The cold seeped into his bones, his vision blurred by the suffocating blackness that coiled and lashed around him. His screams echoed in the tomb-like space, bouncing off the stone walls, mingling with the chorus of whispers that refused to die. Suddenly, there was a flicker, a tiny, fragile light that glimmered in the distance. It pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing him toward it with an irresistible pull. The shadows shrieked in fury, their serpentine forms writhing as if being scorched by the light. Elias, half-dazed and trembling, clawed his way toward it, ignoring the pain that throbbed in his limbs. The light grew larger, illuminating the space around him. He felt a warmth he hadn't known since the sun had last shone, and with it came a sense of hope that felt almost foreign in the face of so much death. As Elias moved, the figures that had once surrounded him began to dissipate, their voices fading into thin, gossamer whispers that fell silent at last. Before him stood a figure, cloaked in robes that shimmered with threads of gold and silver. Their face was hidden beneath the cowl, but a soft, melodic voice broke the silence, filled with a strange mixture of authority and compassion. "You were warned," the figure said, "but warnings are like whispers in a storm. They get lost in the wind." Elias's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling as he stared at the being before him. His body was cold, bruised from the unseen attacks, but now there was a lightness in the air, a strange calm that kept the tremors at bay. "Who are you?" he managed to say, voice cracking. "Some call me the Keeper of Graves," the figure said, stepping forward. The cowl shifted, and a hand, pale as moonlight and adorned with rings carved from bone, reached out to him. "Others simply call me the Watcher. But tonight, I am your guide." "Guide? How?" Elias stammered, his mind spinning with questions he could not form. The figure tilted its head slightly, the cowl moving just enough to reveal a pair of eyes that were black as obsidian and ancient as the earth itself. "You have trespassed where few dare to go, Elias. But there is more at stake than you understand. The night will test your resolve, and only those who embrace the darkness can ever hope to find salvation." Before Elias could reply, the world around them shifted, collapsing in on itself like a crumbling stage. The tomb they had stood in was now a distant memory, replaced by an endless, gray expanse that seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the jagged stones of the cemetery that reached toward the heavens. "Follow me," the keeper said, and Elias was unable to resist as he took the offered hand. It was cold, lifeless, but somehow grounding. They walked for what felt like hours through the ghostly silence, past stones that whispered secrets in languages he did not know, past graves where figures of shadows stood with eyes full of grief and longing. At last, they came to an old wrought iron gate, its bars twisted like the fingers of a beast long dead. Beyond it, the land stretched into a forest shrouded in an unnatural fog, tendrils of mist curling like pale fingers that reached out to beckon him forward. "The darkness will come for you, Elias," the keeper said, voice gentle but foreboding. "But only by walking through it can you hope to find the truth of what lies beyond." Elias looked back at the keeper, fear and uncertainty dancing in his eyes. But there was also something else, a glimmer of resolve. Whatever this nightmare had become, he knew he could not turn away. With a trembling hand, he stepped through the gate, and the chill of the fog wrapped around him, seeping into his skin, making his heart pound like a war drum. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from the forest. "You cannot hide from what you are," it said. And though the keeper's form faded into the mist behind him, Elias could feel the presence of something ancient, something that watched him as he ventured into the unknown. Elias's every step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself were resisting him. The fog thickened, clinging to him with icy tendrils that seemed to sap his very will. The whispered voices from the cemetery had fallen silent, replaced by the faint sound of wind rustling through skeletal branches. His heart thundered in his chest, the only sound that accompanied him as he moved deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, the silence more suffocating, and the trees around him twisted in unnatural shapes, their limbs reaching like clawed fingers. Their bark, dark and gnarled, was etched with runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, red light, as though breathing. Every step brought him closer to the unknown, the very fabric of reality unraveling under the weight of the forest's malevolence. A sudden rustle behind him made him spin around, eyes wide with terror. The mist shifted and coalesced into shapes that were more than just shadows. Figures, hunched and limping, with hollow eyes that glistened like dark, polished stone. They moved in jerky, stuttering motions, hands outstretched as if yearning for something long lost. Who are you?" Elias stammered, voice trembling as he took an involuntary step back. The figures remained silent, but their movements spoke volumes. They encircled him, closing the space as they shuffled in a discordant dance of desperation. One figure, taller and more imposing than the others, stepped forward. Its features were obscured by the tattered hood of its robe, but its eyes, pale and milky, bore into Elias's soul. A rasping voice broke the silence. "You have come seeking answers, yet you know not what you seek," it hissed. The voice was cold, like a whisper from the grave, echoing in Elias's mind. He wanted to run, to flee from this abomination, but his legs felt like lead, frozen in place. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, and with a deafening crack, a fissure split open at his feet. The mist poured into it, dark and inky, swirling as though alive. From the depths emerged a form that defied description. It was as if the forest itself had birthed a creature forged from nightmares, twisted, amorphous, with limbs that seemed to bend and twist in unnatural directions. Its eyes were pools of pure darkness, and when it spoke, the world seemed to shudder in response. "You dare to challenge the boundary between the living and the dead," it rumbled, voice deep and resonant, vibrating through Elias's bones. I don't understand," Elias whispered, tears pricking his eyes as he stared at the abomination. The keeper's words echoed in his ears. "The darkness will come for you." A sudden sharp pain in his chest snapped him back to reality. He looked down to see the runes on the trees pulsing more brightly, each beat sending a jagged current of pain through him. His vision blurred, and for a moment the world spun around him. "You must remember who you are, Elias," the voice whispered from within, familiar yet distant. His memories began to stir, fragments rising like bubbles to the surface of a dark, murky pond. The forest shifted again, and the figures that surrounded him broke apart into a cloud of swirling mist. He fell to his knees, gasping as the pain in his chest grew unbearable. He remembered the stories he had read as a boy, tales of forbidden places where the veil between life and death was thin, places where the dead whispered secrets only the brave dared to hear. "Not all are meant to cross," the creature said, its form writhing in the mist. "And not all shall return." But Elias knew he could not give in. There was something deeper within him, a spark that refused to be extinguished. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, polished stone, an heirloom passed down through generations, said to be imbued with the spirit of his ancestors. The stone glowed, faint but resolute, casting a warm light that pushed the darkness back. A roar of rage erupted from the creature, its form twisting and slithering as the light expanded. The forest seemed to roar with a deafening chorus, a cacophony of wrath and fear. The shadowy figures turned their gaze to him, eyes wide with an emotion he could not name. The keeper's voice echoed once more, sharp and clear through the din. "Only those who confront their own darkness can find the truth." Elias held the stone close to his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared into the abyss, eyes locked with the creature's, as the ground beneath him shook and cracked, pulling him deeper into a world of shadows where hope seemed but a fleeting ember. The creature's form roared in response to the stone's glow, its dark tendrils lashing out with a force that split the earth beneath it. Elias felt the ground shift, the air grow colder as he struggled to maintain his footing. The stone in his hand pulsed with a warm, golden light, illuminating the forest in sharp contrast against the suffocating darkness. The figures that surrounded him screeched in agony, their hollow eyes wide with terror as they recoiled. Elias's vision blurred with the effort, sweat slicking his brow as he focused on the creature before him. It was now clear that it wasn't just a single being. It was an amalgamation of the forest's rage and despair, an ancient entity born from centuries of torment. The twisted trees shuddered, their roots reaching out like grasping hands, clawing at the ground as if to drag him down into their depths. "You cannot banish me, mortal," the creature bellowed, its voice slicing through the chaos like a jagged blade. The world around Elias seemed to stretch and warp, time slipping between seconds, as if reality itself were fraying at the edges. He took a shaky breath, the weight of the stone searing into his palm. It was as if the light within it spoke to him, urging him forward, urging him to confront the very part of himself that he had buried for so long. The dark memories, the loss, the fear that had brought him here. "You are the keeper of your own fate, Elias," the voice whispered within him, now louder, more insistent. The mist thickened, forming grotesque faces that shifted and melted before his eyes, each one echoing a silent scream. He realized now that they were the spirits of the forest, the lost, the forgotten, all bound to this place and now staring at him, seeking release. With one final, shuddering breath, Elias drove the stone into the gnarled earth before him. The ground beneath him trembled, sending splinters of rock and root flying into the air. A brilliant light burst from the stone, forcing the creature back with a howl of rage that sent tremors through the forest. The figures that had once surrounded him crumbled to the ground, their dark forms dissipating into clouds of smoke that vanished into the ether. The creature roared one last time, a sound that echoed long after it had disappeared, and with it, the forest began to change. The twisted trees fell silent, their bark losing its unnatural glow. The fog thinned, dispersing like a shroud that had long kept its secrets. The cold melted into a cool, soft breeze, and Elias's vision cleared as the sun's pale light pierced through the canopy above. He fell to his knees, the stone clutched to his chest as exhaustion overcame him. The forest was no longer a place of dread. It now seemed as if it were breathing, a new life taking root from the dark. But as he looked up, there was no sign of the ancient terror that had nearly consumed him. The woods whispered, but now it was a sound of release, a soft, sorrowful farewell. Elias's body ached from the ordeal, his mind haunted by the memory of the whispers that had threatened to take him. But as he stood and looked around, he realized the forest had shown him its true face, one that was both dark and beautiful, alive and ancient. In the distance, a narrow path stretched into the heart of the woods, marked by trees whose roots intertwined like fingers, as if protecting a secret. Elias felt an irresistible pull toward it, a call that resonated deep within his soul. This was not the end, but the beginning of something new. And in the distance, barely audible, the whisper of the forest carried a promise. The darkness will always return, but so will the light.